Please like, share, and subscribe. Wishing you happiness and good luck every day.
All right, today we're going to dive into the mind of a true titan of thinking, Charlie Munger. Now, you probably know him as Warren Buffett's right-hand man at Berkshire Hathaway, but his real legacy, it's not just about investing. It's about a revolutionary way of thinking he called worldly wisdom. And honestly, it's a toolkit that can help pretty much anyone make smarter decisions. So Munger's whole philosophy really starts with this one giant nagging question. Why is it that incredibly smart people, we're talking experts, geniuses at the top of their game, make such spectacularly bad decisions? You see it all the time, right? This isn't just a business thing. It's a fundamental human flaw. And it's the exact puzzle Munger devoted his life to solving. His solution starts with this quote, which is just classic Munger. It's a perfect example of what he called inversion. You basically flip the problem on its head. So instead of asking, how can I succeed, you ask, what are all the things that would guarantee my failure? And then you religiously avoid those things. It's such a powerful mental trick because let's face it, it is way easier to spot and avoid stupidity than it is to create genius. Once you know where all the landmines are, the path forward gets a whole lot clearer. Okay, so what is the biggest pitfall? What's the number one reason smart people screw up? Munger believed he found the culprit, and he saw it as this plague of narrow-minded thinking that's everywhere, from university campuses to boardrooms. He called it the curse of the over-specialized expert. And this old saying just perfectly captures it. Munger saw that if you're an expert in just one thing, say you're an economist or an engineer, you tend to view every single problem through that one lens. You use your one tool for every job. But the world is way too complex for that. As Munger said, you can't find all the world's wisdom in one little academic department. Relying on a single way of thinking is, frankly, a recipe for total disaster. So, if that's the disease, what's the cure? Well, to really get Munger's brilliant solution, you kind of have to get the man himself. Warren Buffett famously called him his abominable no-man. Why? Because Munger had this absolutely ruthless ability to just say no and kill terrible ideas before they could cause any damage. He was also a self-described biography nut, just a machine for continuous learning. His secret weapon? He made friends with what he called the eminent dead. Think Benjamin Franklin, Einstein, the greatest minds in history, by devouring their writings and basically downloading their best ideas directly into his brain. Okay, so if being stuck in one discipline is a trap, how do you get out? This is where Munger's big idea comes in, his masterpiece, really. He developed an antidote he called the Latticework of Mental Models, and it's one of the most powerful intellectual tools you can possibly build. The goal here isn't just to be smart in a narrow field. The goal is to achieve worldly wisdom. Just imagine being able to look at a complex problem and see it not just as an economist or as a psychologist or as a physicist, but seeing it through all of those lenses at the exact same time. That's the level of deep understanding Munger was shooting for. And the name itself is so important. A latticework isn't just a list. It's a crisscrossing structure where every single point connects to every other point. For Munger, this is exactly how knowledge should work. It's not about memorizing isolated facts. You hang your experiences and new ideas onto this interconnected framework, and suddenly you start seeing the hidden patterns and relationships between, well, everything. Now, right about now, you're probably thinking, okay, this sounds incredibly difficult. Like, I have to become an expert in everything. But here's the beautiful part. Munger figured you don't need to know it all. He estimated that just 80 to 90 of these core mental models will do about 90% of the heavy lifting you need to be truly worldly wise. And where do you find these models? Well, you go shopping. You take these single, biggest, most powerful ideas from all the major fields of study. We're talking concepts like cognitive biases from psychology, advantages of scale from economics, tipping points from physics, and natural selection from biology. You just grab the most powerful tool from each discipline and you add it to your mental toolkit. Okay, this all sounds great in theory, but what does it actually look like when you put it to work? Well, Munger had this famous thought experiment he used to show off the raw power of combining these models, and it involved one of the most famous brands on Earth. I want you to imagine this. You're in Atlanta. It's 1884. Some guy named Glotz hands you $2 million, a fortune back then, and says, I want you to start a non-alcoholic beverage company. The goal? Make it worth $2 trillion in 150 years. The only rule is you have to call it Coca-Cola. So how on earth would you do it? Munger's answer is just a masterclass in using the latticework. First, you pull a model from psychology, Pavlovian conditioning. You make sure your drink is associated with every single happy, wonderful image you can think of. Sunshine, friends, joy, you name it. Then, for microeconomics, you use the incredible power of scale to make your drink cheap and available everywhere. And from chemistry, you create a unique, secret flavor that's almost impossible for anyone to copy. And this is where the real magic happens. When you combine all these different forces, the psychological pull, the economic advantages, the chemical uniqueness, they don't just add up. Nope, they multiply. They feed off each other and create this massive, runaway, self-reinforcing outcome that Munger loves to call a Lollapalooza effect. And that is exactly what Coca-Cola became. But here's something that is absolutely crucial to understand. Munger believed that this whole intellectual toolkit is basically useless on its own. It has to be built on a rock-solid foundation of personal character and certain mental habits. His system really is as much about how you live as it is about how you think. He boils it all down to these 4 pillars. First, preparation, just a relentless, lifelong quest for knowledge. Second, discipline, having the brutal honesty to know your own biases and avoid fooling yourself, because you are the easiest person to fool. Third, patience. You have to wait for the perfect opportunity, not swing at every single pitch. And finally, decisiveness. When that rare, perfect pitch does come along, you swing with everything you've got. So the big question is, how do we start building this for ourselves? Because this way of thinking isn't just for billionaires investing in stocks. It's a really practical guide for making better decisions in your career, in your relationships, in your own life. And it's available to anyone who's willing to put in the work. So where do you even start building your own latticework? Munger's answer was always incredibly simple and direct. You read constantly, and you read broadly. He famously said, "In my whole life, I have known no wise people who didn't read all the time. None. Zero." It's as simple and as hard as that. And you have to understand, for Munger, this isn't just some clever life hack to get ahead. He genuinely believed that acquiring wisdom is a fundamental obligation. To just stumble through life in a state of preventable ignorance, making bad decisions that hurt you and the people around you, to him, that was a moral failing. The pursuit of wisdom isn't just a good idea. It's a moral duty. Look, Munger's path is not easy. It really demands humility and a commitment to lifelong learning. You have to constantly confront what you don't know. But the rewards, as he put it, are awesome, absolutely awesome. So the challenge he leaves for all of us is a simple one. Which big idea from a field you know absolutely nothing about are you going to learn next? What's the very first model you're going to add to your own latticework?
You know, when you think of Berkshire Hathaway, one name immediately comes to mind: Warren Buffett. But behind the icon was his indispensable partner, a man who, well, intentionally stayed out of the limelight. Today, we're going to pull back that curtain and take a deep dive into the life and mind of that man, Charlie Munger.
So, Charlie Munger was just an absolute machine when it came to reading, especially biographies. He had this whole philosophy that the best way to learn was to make friends with the eminent dead, and his #1 hero, Benjamin Franklin. This quote from Franklin really it perfectly sets the stage for what we're about to do. Recollect the amazing life that built one of the sharpest minds in the history of capitalism.
Okay, so you have Warren Buffett, who became this public face of investing, right? The famous Oracle of Omaha. But Charlie Munger? He played a totally different game. He was the silent partner, the intellectual sparring partner. His main job was basically to challenge every single idea. And you know what? As we're about to see, that very dynamic was the absolute secret sauce to their unbelievable success.
All right, here's the game plan. First, we'll look at his famous role as the No Man. Then, we'll rewind to his childhood, check out his very unique education, and see how he jumped from law to capitalism. We'll also cover the night he met Warren Buffett and wrap it all up with what I'm calling the Munger operating system. So what made this guy so crucial? Well, Warren Buffett himself gave him a nickname that just says it all: the abominable no man. Think about that. Munger's job wasn't to nod and agree. Nope, it was to find the one fatal flaw, to be the guy who says no when everyone else is screaming yes. That kind of intellectual rigor, that was his greatest gift to the whole partnership. And the results of that partnership? I mean, they're just staggering. Since Buffett took over back in '64 and Munger officially joined, Berkshire Hathaway's value has multiplied by, wait for it, 13,500 times. Let that number sink in for a second.
That is why understanding who Charlie Munger was is so incredibly important.
Okay, to really understand the man, you gotta go all the way back to the beginning. Charles Thomas Munger, born in Omaha, Nebraska, back in 1924. You know, the Midwest heartland, it's known for producing these straight-talking, really pragmatic people. And for Charlie, this place was absolutely the crucible that forged his character.
His early life was just one formative experience after another. He saw the Great Depression up close, which gave him this deep, deep respect for financial security. And get this, he had this fateful brush with the Buffett family name long before he met Warren, working at a grocery store owned by Warren's grandpa. Plus, his curiosity was just off the charts. As a teenager, he befriended his family doctor just so he could read his medical journals. Who does that?
Let's stick with that grocery store job for a second, because the lesson here is huge. The owner, Warren's grandfather, was a super strict guy. So imagine this, you're a young kid, you work a grueling 12-hour shift for $2. At the end of the day, you have to hand back 2 pennies for the new Social Security tax, and you get a whole lecture on the evils of socialism while you're at it. I mean, talk about a tough early lesson in economics and self-reliance.
You know, for Charlie, the Great Depression wasn't just some abstract thing he read about in a history book. It was his classroom. He literally watched his grandfather, who was a federal judge, risk almost half of his own money to save his uncle's bank. He saw him help another relative get a pharmacy off the ground. These weren't just nice family gestures. They were powerful lessons in pragmatism, in risk, and in just how critical it is to have a financial cushion so you can weather any storm.
So all these early experiences led to an education that was, well, anything but a straight line. Munger never really followed the conventional path. His journey was more of a zigzag, and this intellectual wandering became the absolute foundation for his famous multidisciplinary approach to solving problems.
I mean, just look at this journey. He starts off studying math at the University of Michigan. Then he leaves to join the Army Air Corps during World War II. The Army, in its infinite wisdom, decides to send him to Caltech to study meteorology. And then comes the masterstroke. He never even finished his bachelor's degree, but he somehow talks his way into Harvard Law School. It's just an incredible testament to his raw intellect and his ability to adapt.
But the big takeaway from all that science training was his fascination with physics. And it wasn't just the subject itself, it was the method, the way physicists break down problems and look for these fundamental, universal truths. He truly believed this way of thinking was a superpower, one you could apply to absolutely any field, from business to, well, life itself. So after graduating with high honors from Harvard, Munger's life, it just took a series of incredibly difficult turns. First, a divorce, and then he faced something just unimaginable. His young son, Teddy, was diagnosed with leukemia. A friend later recalled seeing Charlie visit his dying son in the hospital, and then just walking the streets of Pasadena, crying by himself. It was a period of just profound hardship, but it was also a time where he found love again, marrying Nancy Borthwick and blending their 2 families together.
Even though he was a successful lawyer, practicing law was never the end goal for Charlie. He had this big realization. He saw that his earnings were always going to be tied to how many hours he could bill. But his clients, the ones he really admired, they were capitalists. They made their money work for them. So he made a very conscious, very strategic decision. Law was going to be the stepping stone to his own financial independence.
And this part just perfectly shows his methodical approach. This wasn't some daydream. He had a concrete plan. Step 1, use his law salary for seed money. Step 2, study his successful clients to learn the ropes. Step 3, start with small investments, like a real estate partnership. And the crucial part, Step 4, reinvest every single penny of profit. That's what let him tackle bigger and bigger projects over time.
And look, this was not just some side hustle. Through those early real estate ventures, he built a personal nest egg of about $1 million. And remember, this is back in the 1960s. It was basically a get-rich-slow scheme that actually worked. And that $1 million, that's what gave him the freedom to finally leave law behind and go all in as an investor.
Okay, this brings us to the moment where financial history just completely changed. It's 1959. Charlie has to go back to Omaha to handle his late father's estate. His childhood friends, the Davis family, decide to throw a dinner party for him. And on that guest list was a bright young investor who, as it turns out, Dr. Davis had once said reminded him of Charlie. That young investor? A 29-year-old Warren Buffett.
And the connection was just instant, electric.
Buffett himself tells the story that he knew he'd found a kindred spirit when Charlie started laughing so hard at his own jokes that he was literally rolling on the floor. It was about more than just business. It was this incredible meeting of minds and personalities that just clicked right away.
But for an even more telling perspective, listen to what Warren's first wife, Susie, said about that night. She was there. She said that Warren was always the dominant intellect in any room, always the fastest, smartest person. But that night, for the very first time she had ever seen, Warren actually went quiet and let someone else take the lead in the conversation. And that someone, of course, was Charlie Munger.
So when you ask Warren Buffett what's the secret to Charlie's success, he boils it down to these key traits. First and foremost, the man was just incredibly rational. But on top of that, he had this old-fashioned integrity, a crazy work ethic, and he just never second-guessed himself. As Buffett says, Charlie marches to his own music. He's got his own mold. What a great way to put it.
All right, so as we start to wrap this up, let's try to distill everything we've learned into a few core ideas. What was the software running in Charlie Munger's brain? What was his unique operating system for business and for life?
Well, it's funny. For a guy who valued rationality above absolutely everything, his friends loved to joke about something they called Munger's Folly. It was this huge catamaran that he designed and built himself. Warren Buffett used to joke that after Charlie managed to sink a boat on a perfectly calm lake one time, he finally built one stable enough that even he could pilot it. But for Charlie, it was simple. He just said the boat was fun to design and build. It's a great reminder that even the most rational mind needs a passion project.
But the real, true core of his operating system, it really comes back to this one powerful idea. Learn from the best that history has to offer. Make Adam Smith your friend. Make Ben Franklin your mentor. By engaging with these incredible thinkers from the past, you arm yourself with what he called a latticework of mental models that can help you solve almost any problem. This, right here, was Munger's ultimate intellectual advantage.
And so, we're going to end by turning Munger's powerful philosophy right back around to you. All the knowledge of the world's greatest minds is just sitting there, waiting for you in books and biographies. So the question is pretty simple, really. Who are the eminent dead that can help you navigate your life and your career?
Okay, here's a wild idea for you. What if the part of life we all seem to fear the most, getting old, is actually the best part? It sounds crazy, I know, but today we're going to explore that exact idea with a little help from a Roman statesman who lived 2,000 years ago and a modern-day business icon. So that's a quote from the late, great Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's legendary partner at Berkshire Hathaway. Now think about this. In 2006, when he said this, Munger was 82 years old. He was at the absolute peak of his powers. So why on earth would a 2,000-year-old book send him into orbit? Because this ancient text from the philosopher Cicero said something out loud that Munger felt deep in his bones, that old age, far from being a tragedy, could be a triumph. And that really brings us to the core question we're tackling today. It's a huge one, right? It goes against pretty much everything our culture tells us about aging. We're going to use Cicero's wisdom through the eyes of Charlie Munger to see if it's possible that our later years can be a time of just incredible satisfaction and purpose. You ready? Let's dive in. All right, so our story doesn't start in ancient Rome with togas and scrolls. Nope. It starts in 2006 with a gift that showed up in the mail and ended up sparking this whole incredible reflection. You see, the book Munger got wasn't just some random text. It was a reprint of the very first American translation of Cicero's work, De Senectute, which literally means on old age. And get this, the guy who first published it in America back in 1744, none other than Benjamin Franklin, a man who, as we'll see, basically became the living embodiment of Cicero's ideas. For Munger, this was an instant click. You know, Munger himself always said he got more enthusiastic about ideas as he was explaining them to other people. And here's Cicero, 2,000 years earlier, saying the exact same thing. He's saying that the simple act of writing down these positive ideas about aging made him feel great. It wasn't a chore, it was a joy. So what did Cicero actually say that was so groundbreaking? Well, he basically took on the 4 biggest complaints that people have about getting old. That it takes you out of the game, that it makes your body weak, that you can't enjoy life's pleasures, and that you're close to death. Let's see how he just completely turns these arguments on their head. This comparison just nails Cicero's main point. He basically asks, what would you rather have? The raw physical power of Milo, the famous athlete who could literally carry an ox on his shoulders, or the world-changing brain power of the philosopher Pythagoras? For Cicero, it's not even a contest. The mind is always superior to the body, and the powers of the mind, things like wisdom and reason and judgment, they only get stronger with age. And he drives the point home with this perfect example from history. In the middle of the Trojan War, when the stakes were highest, the commander Agamemnon didn't say, "I wish I had 10 more super strong warriors like Ajax." No, he said, "I wish I had 10 more wise old counselors like Nestor." When it really counts, in the most critical moments, it's wisdom, not muscle, that wins the day, and that is the unique power of age. So you see, Cicero totally flips the script. Old age isn't about what you lose, it's about what you gain. It's the time you get to feel pride in a lifetime of work. It's the perfect time to just delight in learning new things. He talks about Socrates learning the fiddle in his old age. And, maybe best of all, it's a time of freedom. Freedom from all those crazy, chaotic, and sometimes kind of dumb passions of our youth. Okay, so this isn't just about feeling better about getting old. Cicero's philosophy is actually a practical guide. It's a set of instructions for all of us, no matter our age, on how to prepare. He calls it building an armor for a well-lived life. And here's his 5-step plan for building that armor. It's such a timeless recipe for a meaningful life. You gotta keep learning, you gotta dedicate yourself to something bigger than you have to stay in the game, you have to stand up for yourself, and maybe the most important one, you have to choose gratitude over grievance. This idea of serving a greater good, it's all about legacy, isn't it? It's that old saying about planting trees whose shade you know you'll never get to sit in. It completely shifts your focus from what you can get right now to what you can give to the future. It's exactly how people like Charlie Munger lived their lives. Now, this one is pretty radical, especially for our world today. Cicero saw retirement, just disengaging from your life's work, as a kind of desertion. He believed we have a duty, a responsibility, to stay active and contribute for as long as we possibly can. The whole idea of just quitting because you hit a certain age was totally unthinkable to him. And Cicero had absolutely no patience for old folks who just hoarded their wealth. His logic here is just so sharp and funny. He's basically saying, can you think of anything more ridiculous than frantically packing more food for a trip when you're already pulling into the station? Resources are meant to be used for good, not just counted up as your life winds down. This might be his most brilliant argument of all. It's this amazing little piece of logical jujitsu. Think about it. No young person hopes to die young. The unspoken hope of all young people is to get to be old one day. So when you finally arrive, when you achieve that best-case scenario, why would you complain about it? It completely reframes aging from a loss into a victory. What's so amazing is that these aren't just abstract ideas from an old book. They form this golden thread of wisdom that we can trace through history. And more importantly, we can see it lived out by some of the most effective and admirable people who ever lived. I mean, just look at this journey. It starts with Cicero in the Roman Republic. Then, almost 2,000 years later, Ben Franklin picks up the torch in colonial America. Fast forward to our time, and Charlie Munger rediscovers it, and today you can see his partner, Warren Buffett, living it out every single day. It's just incredible proof that these ideas are timeless. And Franklin is the perfect case study. He didn't just print the book, he was the book. Into his 80s, suffering from all sorts of physical problems, he was still a central figure at the Constitutional Convention, serving his country, building a future he knew he'd never fully see. His later years were an absolute masterclass in how to live. And today, you could say that baton has been passed to people like Warren Buffett. At an age when almost everyone else is long retired, he's joyfully in the game. But it's more than that. He uses his incredible platform to constantly teach, to share his wisdom on business and on life. He's the perfect modern example of that Ciceronian ideal of serving others right until the very end. So, as we start to wrap this all up, we get to the central message, the real heart of Cicero's philosophy. And it is just as powerful and relevant today as it was over 2,000 years ago. This is the one everyone remembers, and for good reason. It's the whole takeaway in a nutshell. A good old age isn't about luck. It's something you earn. It's the harvest of a life well lived, the knowledge you chase, the good deeds you do, the character you build. These are the things you use, day by day, to forge the armor that will protect and comfort you in your later years. But Charlie Munger, ever the realist, adds a crucial modern update here. She basically says, look, Cicero's ideas are powerful, but let's be honest, not everybody can be Warren Buffett. Life happens. For many of us, there comes a time when we have to step back. And the key, Munger says, is to make that adjustment cheerfully, to find new ways to be useful and stay engaged.
And we'll end with this final powerful idea that just turns our whole world upside down. To Cicero, if you live your life the right way, the early part with all its mistakes, its lack of wisdom, its focus on the physical, that's the inferior part. The best, the richest, the most meaningful part of your life is the end, but only if you spend your whole life earning it.
So the whole point of this isn't to just be a lesson for the elderly. It is a direct call to action for every single one of us right now. The quality of your old age is being decided by the choices you make today. So the question to leave you with is this: what are you doing to build your armor? What knowledge are you chasing? What honorable actions are you taking today that are going to become a source of strength and comfort for your future self?
You know, when you hear the name Charlie Munger, your mind probably jumps straight to the legendary investor, right? The genius, right-hand man to Warren Buffett. But today, we're going to look past the stock picks and the balance sheets. We're going to get a peek behind the curtain through the eyes of his own kids and his closest friends to understand the principles he used to build a truly well-lived life.
I mean, this quote just nails it, doesn't it? That's the public image of Charlie Munger, this monumental, imposing figure, solid, unmovable, maybe even a little bit intimidating. A personality so big you could carve it into a mountain. But a personality that huge also casts a really long shadow, and it kind of makes you wonder.
Because here's the thing. For all the talk about his genius, the real lessons, the ones that truly mattered, they weren't happening in some fancy boardroom. Nope, they were being forged at the family dinner table, on ski trips, and in these quiet, everyday moments. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to uncover the foundational principles he lived by, told through these really intimate family stories. So to start, we really have to look behind that public persona, because the truest measure of anybody, really, is found in those small, private moments that show you the code they actually live by.
And Munger taught that this code, our character, it isn't something you prove with big, flashy gestures for everyone to see. It's actually forged in the small acts of fairness, especially when it's inconvenient, and when nobody is looking. Okay, so picture this. His son, Charles T. Munger Jr., is about 15 years old. They're in Sun Valley, wrapping up a ski vacation, and they are in a huge rush to catch their flight home. But his dad insists they make a detour that, to a 15-year-old, makes 0 sense.
That was his father's simple, non-negotiable instruction. Now you got to keep in mind, the gas tank was already half full, and the Jeep belonged to a very wealthy friend who probably wouldn't even notice, let alone care. But that was never, ever the point.
And this is where the lesson just clicks into place. See, integrity isn't about what you do when you think you might get caught. It's a habit you build with these small and convenient actions. And these little things, they have huge ripple effects. Years later, his son borrowed a car in college, remembered the lesson, and topped off the half-full tank. And you know what? The owner noticed. That person ended up being a groomsman in his wedding. Absolute fairness, it doesn't just build your character. It forges real, lasting friendships.
But look, this principle of doing the job right the first time, it wasn't always taught with a gentle reminder. Munger really believed in the power of, let's call them, direct and unforgettable experiences. And for his stepson Hal, one of those experiences involved a boat, a pretty big storm, and a forgotten newspaper. He was sent right back out into the storm. It was a harsh order, for sure. But as Hal remembered it, while he was out there, bouncing around in the waves, with rain pouring down, the lesson became absolutely unforgettable. You fulfill your obligations, period, no matter how difficult it is. He never forgot the newspaper again.
Fulfilling your obligations, whether it's as simple as grabbing a newspaper or as complex as building a business, it requires focus. And Munger's ability to focus was, well, it was legendary. It was his superpower and honestly his most baffling quirk.
I mean, we're not just talking about putting your phone on silent here. His son described it like one of those old beer commercials where a guy's so into his drink he doesn't even notice a rampaging bull. For Munger, the drink was a financial report or a biography,
and the world around him, including his own family, could just completely cease to exist. This focus was so absolute that even his closest partner, Warren Buffett, could just become invisible. Can you imagine this? They've just left a board meeting in New York. Buffett is in the middle of a sentence. He turns, and he realizes he's talking to thin air. Munger had just hailed a cab and left for the airport. His mind was already on the next thing.
And that wasn't a one-off thing. Social niceties, the normal stuff, they could just vanish when his mind was locked on a problem. After a perfectly friendly and successful negotiation, Munger's partners just stood there totally bewildered as he walked straight into an open elevator without a single word. No goodbye, no handshake. His brain had already left the building.
And it wasn't just about business. He applied this intense focus to everything. His son David remembers him just endlessly practicing simple volley shots with a tennis ball machine. The boring short game stuff that other people ignore. Why? To give himself that same maddening edge on the court. It was all about his ability to direct 100% of his intellect onto a single problem.
All right, Munger famously said, invert, always invert. He really believed that one of the best ways to figure out the right thing to do was to first identify all the wrong things to do. And this was a lesson he taught relentlessly, usually by studying failure and human folly right there at the family dinner table.
His daughter Wendy remembers he had two main teaching tools. First, you had the straightforward morality tale, about someone who did the right thing. But then there was his specialty, his absolute masterpiece, the downward spiral tale.
Oh, he would just vividly describe the whole inevitable series of catastrophic personal and professional losses that would follow one single bad choice. By studying what to avoid with this kind of dark humor and, frankly, horrific detail, he taught his kids how to navigate life's big messes and, stay on the side of the angels.
And this wasn't just some intellectual exercise. He made them feel it. His daughter Molly remembers being a kid on this heavy wooden board being towed by a boat. Her dad would make these sharp turns, and the only way to avoid the total disgrace of falling off was to constantly shift your weight, to compensate. It literally hardwired a physical aversion to letting any idea or activity get too far out of balance.
So we have integrity, intense focus, and this idea of inversion. But how did all these principles actually translate into a legacy? Well, it turns out Munger's most important lessons weren't always taught directly. They came through his actions and this kind of subtle, indirect wisdom. His son Barry, looking back on his dad's reserved, kind of Midwestern nature, had this amazing realization. He saw that Munger got so much across without ever having those big, emotional, heart-to-heart talks. He sent his messages through articles he'd share, anecdotes he'd tell to a group, and just the way he lived. It was a code you had to learn how to read.
So Barry decides, okay, I'm going to try to communicate in my father's own language. He sends him a book that he felt really captured his dad's essence, a subtle way of saying, I get you and I appreciate you. But then, about a week later, the book comes back in the mail. No note. It just felt like a total rejection, a message tossed against the granite slopes of Mount Rushmore.
But he had read the situation completely wrong. The message wasn't rejected at all. It was amplified. His father understood perfectly. He had simply told his secretary to buy copies of the book and send them to the entire family. The message got through, Munger style.
From a full tank of gas to a silent elevator ride, from stories of total doom to a book shared with the whole family, these aren't just weird quirks. They're the brushstrokes that paint a full picture of a life built on a few powerful, durable principles. He always admired the lasting quality of a Brooks Brothers suit, and he built his own life to be just as enduring.
In the end, Charlie Munger's story is a powerful reminder that our greatest legacy isn't something written in a will or spoken in a big speech. It's built from the thousands of small, consistent actions that show who we really are. It's the subtle code we choose to live by every single day.
So how do you really understand a legendary mind like Charlie Munger? Well, one of the best ways is to see him through the eyes of other giants who knew him best. And today we're going to decode his genius by looking at him from the perspective of two of them, Howard Buffett and, most importantly, Bill Gates. Let's dive in. To get Charlie Munger, you have to start right here. This one idea, it was the absolute bedrock of his entire worldview. But it's not just about, work hard. For Munger, this was a philosophy of just radical focus. He believed the world is way too competitive to win by being pretty good at a bunch of things. Nope. The only real path to success was to find your circle of competence, that one thing you have a real edge in, and then just pound away at it relentlessly. It's all about strategic effort, and it's the foundation for everything else we're about to talk about. All right, so here's our roadmap for today. We just touched on his core philosophy. Next, we're going to see Munger through the eyes of Warren Buffett's son, Howard. Then we'll get Bill Gates' really unique introduction to Charlie. We'll explore why Gates called him the broadest thinker he'd ever met. And finally, we'll break down some of Munger's unforgettable and often brutally honest maxims. Okay, let's get into the first part of our journey. We're going to start with someone who had a front row seat to the Munger intellect for decades, Howard Buffett, the son of Charlie's legendary business partner, Warren Buffett. Howard Buffett is pretty blunt about it. His interactions with Munger were, well, intimidating. He talks about how conversations with him were basically one-sided. I mean, can you imagine sitting with someone whose brain is building these incredibly complex mental models right in front of you in real time? It wasn't just a casual chat. It was more like an intellectual event where just trying to keep up felt like a huge challenge. And you have to understand, this feeling wasn't about Munger using big words just to sound smart. Not at all. Howard says it was about the sheer density of the ideas. Munger's thinking was just so layered, operating at such a high level, that Howard admitted he was often scared to even ask a question because he was afraid of looking stupid. That's the kind of intellectual gravity the man had. And really nothing captures it better than this right here. Just think about the weight of that statement for a second. Howard Buffett, who grew up alongside Warren Buffett, one of the most brilliant minds of our time, is on the record saying Charlie Munger was number one. Now, he's kind of tried to walk it back since then, probably to keep the peace at Thanksgiving, but that original gut feeling, it just speaks volumes about the awe Munger inspired. So with that intellectual bar set incredibly high, let's pivot to our main perspective, Bill Gates. Now, before Gates ever even met Munger, Warren Buffett gave him a couple of, let's just call them curious warnings about the guy he was about to meet. I mean, can you just picture that? You're at a dinner party, and Munger so completely owns the conversation that he'll literally physically put his hand up to make everyone else stay quiet just so he can take a sip of his drink without losing the floor. It's such a small detail, but it paints this huge picture of his dominant, kind of eccentric, and totally unique personality. He was always in control of the room. And then you have this fantastic story. Munger, this stratospheric genius, once sank a boat on a perfectly calm lake by just throwing it into full speed reverse. It creates this absolutely brilliant contrast, right? Here's a man who can grasp the most complex ideas in the world, yet he's also capable of this comically simple mistake. It doesn't make him less of a genius, it just makes him wonderfully, fallibly human. So after an introduction full of all these quirks and warnings about his conversational style, Gates finally met the man himself. And according to Gates, Charlie Munger didn't just live up to the hype, he surpassed it, which led to Gates' ultimate assessment of his mind. Now, this isn't just high praise. This is Bill Gates, a man who has spent his entire life talking to brilliant people, saying that Charlie Munger had more intellectual range than anyone. He didn't say smartest or quickest, he said broadest. So what does it actually mean to be the broadest thinker? Well, it means Munger's intellect just refused to stay in one lane. Of course, he had business and economics down cold, but Gates points out his expertise went all the way to the architectural design of student dorms, and even the physics of designing catamarans. And then there's the kicker. Their longest-running back and forth was a detailed discussion on the mating habits of naked mole rats and what humanity could learn from them. Now that is breadth. But here's the thing. Munger's genius wasn't just in knowing about all these different topics. It was in his incredible ability to take all that knowledge and communicate it. He could boil down these hugely complex ideas into simple, unforgettable, and often brutally honest phrases. He was an absolute master of the maxim, that short, punchy statement that just cuts right to the heart of an issue. For him, these weren't just clever sayings. They were like precision tools he used to make his wisdom sticky, easy to grasp, and completely impossible to ignore. Take this, for example. When he was talking about how smart kids are, he'd just call it the genetic lottery. Boom. In 3 perfectly chosen words, he cuts through all the endless, complicated debates about nature versus nurture with this blunt, memorable clarity. His point was simple. Some things are just out of your control. And he definitely did not pull his punches. When some venture capitalists were defending practices he thought were shady, he dropped this darkly humorous and absolutely searing analogy. I mean, the image is so raw and so vivid, you never ever forget the point he was making about being complicit in something you know is wrong. This one's a perfect example of his folksy wisdom explaining a really complex economic idea. He was talking about cost-plus contracts, right? Which can kill efficiency. But instead of some dense explanation, he gives us this image. The mule that gets paid by the hour, not by how much it delivers, instinctively knows to take its sweet time. He made an abstract concept feel like simple common sense. So when we piece it all together, a much clearer picture of Munger's genius starts to emerge. It was this really unique combination. It started with that intensely focused philosophy. It was powered by this vast, boundless intellect that could intimidate anybody. It was all packaged in an eccentric, totally unforgettable personality. And maybe most importantly, it was delivered through this amazing talent for communication that made his wisdom sharp, clear, and permanent. Ultimately, decoding Charlie Munger kind of leaves us with this thought. We often think of genius as just pure intellectual horsepower, but Munger's story suggests it's something more than that. What if real, lasting impact doesn't just come from being smart, but from combining that intelligence with the courage to be unapologetically, authentically, and unforgettably yourself? You've definitely heard of Warren Buffett, but what about the man he called his perfect partner? Today, we're diving deep into the mind of Charlie Munger and breaking down his incredible approach to life, learning, and decision-making. So let's kick things off with this classic Munger quote. Take a simple idea and take it seriously. Now, on the surface, that sounds, well, simple, right? But this is so much more than a catchy phrase. It's literally the cornerstone of his entire way of thinking. I mean, just think about that for a second. The guy Warren Buffett calls his perfect partner. There's got to be something really special going on there, right? So, what is his secret? How did he become so incredibly successful? Well, that's exactly what we're here to unpack. All right, so where do we even begin? Let's start with the basics, the Munger approach. You know, to really get a handle on Munger, you first have to understand who he looked up to. And for him, that was Benjamin Franklin. When you look at them side by side, it's actually pretty wild. Both of them were largely self-taught, and both had this just endless curiosity about, well, everything. Munger really modeled his life on Franklin, mastering preparation, patience, and discipline. And here's the key. For him, being a great investor wasn't some separate skill. It was just the natural result of how he approached his entire life. And believe me, that approach paid off. Just listen to what Warren Buffett himself said. He claimed Charlie can spot the weakness in any deal in 60 seconds. 60 seconds! Now that's not some kind of magic trick. It's the product of a really specific, really unique way of thinking. Okay, so what is this unique way of thinking? Well, that brings us right to the heart of his philosophy, what he famously called a latticework of models. Munger had this great critique of experts. He called it the man with a hammer syndrome. You know the saying, if all you have is a hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. So if you're an economist, you try to solve every problem with economics. Munger said that's a terrible way to see reality. His solution was to build a toolkit of multiple mental models, basically learning the big ideas from all the major fields so you can look at any problem from tons of different angles. And when we say all the major fields, we really mean it. Just look at this list. He's pulling from history, psychology, math, engineering, biology, physics, I mean, the whole shebang. He truly believed you couldn't understand the world unless you had a basic fluency in all of these different areas. So why go to all this trouble? Well, Munger loved this quote from the biologist Julian Huxley, and it really gets to the core of it. The idea is that nothing happens in isolation, right? A business isn't just a business. It's a complex system that's connected to human psychology, to economic forces, to history. One single mental model just can't show you the whole picture. You have to see how it's all connected. And this is where things get really, really powerful. Because when you get 2, 3, or maybe 4 of these different models all pushing in the same direction, the result isn't just 1 + 1 + 1. No, you get what Munger called a Lollapalooza effect. It's not addition, it's multiplication. It's like a chain reaction, an absolute explosion of an outcome that's way, way bigger than you'd expect. Let's make this real. Think about Coca-Cola. First, you could apply a model from physics, something called autocatalysis. Fancy word, but the idea is simple. The process feeds itself.
The more people drink Coke, the more stores stock it, which makes it easier for even more people to drink it. Okay, now let's layer on a model from psychology, like Pavlovian conditioning. For over 100 years, Coke has brilliantly linked its drink to happiness, friends, and good times. So you have these powerful forces from different disciplines working together. They don't just add up, they multiply, creating this unstoppable global powerhouse. That's a Lollapalooza. Okay, so this Latticework of Models is a pretty cool intellectual framework, but how does he actually use it in the real world to find a great business? Well, the first step is actually incredibly simple. He's ruthless with his attention. He has 3 mental baskets, yes, no, and 2 tough to understand. Heavily promoted IPOs, that's an immediate no. A super complex tech company, straight into the 2 tough pile. By doing this, he filters out almost everything and can focus all his brainpower on that tiny pile of simple, understandable businesses in the yes basket. And this gets at one of his most famous ideas, the circle of competence. He had this great story to explain it about the physicist Max Planck's chauffeur. The chauffeur had heard Planck give the same lecture so many times that he memorized it and bet he could deliver it himself. So he did. He got up on stage and gave the lecture word for word. But then, a scientist in the audience asked a follow-up question, and the chauffeur was totally busted. The point of the story is you have to be brutally honest with yourself. Do you really understand something, or are you just repeating what you've heard? You have to know when you're Planck and when you're the chauffeur. So once he finds a business that's actually in his circle of competence, he looks for one thing above all else, a moat. Just like a castle, a great business needs a protective moat around it, a durable competitive advantage. And here's the kicker. It's not enough for the moat to just exist. He wants to see businesses that are constantly making that moat wider and deeper every single year, making it almost impossible for competitors to even get close. And this idea led to one of the biggest shifts in investing history. You see, Buffett's original style was to buy pretty junky companies at ridiculously cheap prices. Munger's the one who convinced him, no, Warren, a great business at a fair price is way better than a fair business at a great price. He knew the real fortunes were made by owning exceptional companies for the long haul, even if you had to pay a reasonable price for them. But here's the thing. You can have the best analytical brain in the world, but if your psychology is all wrong, it's pretty much useless. Munger was adamant that having the right temperament is just as important, if not more so. A huge part of his temperament comes from this one simple idea, inversion. It's brilliant. Most of us ask, how can I succeed? Munger flips it on its head. He asks, how could this fail completely? He wants to identify all the potential disasters and pitfalls first, so he can just not go there. It's all about avoiding stupidity before you even try to be brilliant. And this quote really gets to the core of it. We all have this natural itch to do something, but Munger says that most of the time, the smartest move is to do nothing at all. He literally calls it sit on your ass investing, just having the discipline to sit there with your cash, waiting patiently, and resisting the urge to chase mediocre ideas. That, he says, is a real superpower. His favorite analogy for this was the baseball legend Ted Williams. Now, Williams was a hitting genius. He famously broke down his strike zone into 77 little squares, and he knew he'd only get a great hit if the ball came into his absolute sweet spot. So he would just stand there and let perfectly good strikes go by, waiting for that one perfect pitch. And that's exactly how Munger sees investing. You don't have to swing at everything. You can wait and wait and wait for that one perfect opportunity, the fat pitch, and when it comes, you swing for the fences. Okay, so we've covered a lot. The latticework, the temperament. How do you keep it all straight? Well, Munger was a massive believer in using checklists to minimize errors. So let's quickly run through his. All right, first up, the foundation. Number 1, risk. Always figure out how you could lose before you even dream about the upside. 2, independence. Think for yourself, period. Don't just follow the herd. 3, preparation. This is the hard work part. There are no shortcuts. 4, intellectual humility. In other words, know what you don't know. And 5, analytic rigor. Treat every decision like a science experiment. And now for the execution. 6, allocation. When you find one of those rare, great ideas, bet big. 7, patience. Remember, sit on your ass investing. Resist the urge to constantly act. 8, decisiveness. When that rare opportunity does show up, you have to pounce. 9, change. The world is always changing, so you have to be willing to adapt. And finally, number 10, focus. Keep it simple. So when you boil it all down, the Munger approach is really a lifelong quest to simply think better. He built his incredible Latticework of Mental Models through a lifetime of nonstop reading across tons of different subjects. And that really leaves us all with a challenge, doesn't it? Munger built his from history, psychology, and physics. The real question is, what disciplines will you use to build yours?
You know, when you think of Berkshire Hathaway, Warren Buffett is probably the first name that comes to mind. But for decades, his indispensable partner, the quiet genius behind the scenes, was Charlie Munger. Today, we're diving into the mind of the man who helped build an empire, not by trying to be a genius, but by relentlessly trying not to be stupid.
And that quote, that's pretty much the whole game right there. Munger's entire philosophy wasn't about chasing some brilliant, complicated idea that no one else understood. Nope. It was about mastering the obvious and just avoiding the common, simple mistakes that trip everyone else up. It's a really powerful and kind of backward way to think about success.
All right, so to really get inside Munger's head, here's what we're going to do. We're going to break it down into 5 key parts. First, we'll meet the man himself. Then we'll unpack the Berkshire philosophy. Look at his totally unique way of investing, dive into his war on financial stupidity, and finally, pull out some of his best mental models for living a smarter life.
So first things first, who exactly was this Charlie Munger guy? Well, to the public, he had this very specific and, let's be honest, very famous persona.
If you've ever watched the Berkshire annual meetings, you've seen this play out. Warren Buffett will go on for a while, then turn to his partner and ask for his thoughts. And Charlie would just sit there, deadpan, and say, "I have nothing to add." Now, this wasn't just some funny habit. It was a sign of his deep agreement with Buffett and his just zero-nonsense approach. But you should not let that silence fool you. And this is where it gets hilarious, right? Buffett's joke here totally cracks the code on their partnership. He'd learned how to calibrate Charlie. See, Munger's default setting was such extreme skepticism that a simple no was actually a pretty good sign. Because if an idea was really bad, oh, you'd know it. He'd tell you it was the dumbest thing he'd ever heard. That shared understanding was basically their superpower.
And this quote really flips the script on the whole no man thing. His real genius wasn't just saying no to bad ideas. It was his incredible discipline to sit there day after day saying no, 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 and then recognizing that 1 in a million opportunity where it was time to bet big. That's where the real money was made.
Okay, so you've got this mindset. How in the world does that build one of the most successful companies in history? Well, let's dig into the Berkshire Hathaway philosophy. And you might be surprised. It's not based on some complex algorithm, but on a few super powerful, old-fashioned ideas. The engine that powers this whole thing, it all comes down to a concept called insurance float. Basically, when you pay your insurance premium, Berkshire gets to hold on to your cash. They can invest it and make money on it for themselves, all before they might have to pay it out for a claim. It's like getting a giant interest-free loan to go invest with.
So here's the magic formula, and it's so simple it's almost infuriating. If you can get that float, that loan, at a really low cost, like 3%, and then turn around and invest it in great businesses that earn 13%, you've created what Munger perfectly described as a hell of a business. That's been the secret sauce for decades.
And you can't have a formula like that without a really unique culture to back it up. What they've built is the total opposite of modern corporate America. It's old school. It's super conservative. They give their managers almost total freedom, what they call total abdication. They don't go chasing deals. They just wait for the absolute no-brainers. It's a culture built on trust and pure rationality. Right? So this unique culture they've built, it naturally leads to an investment style that it completely flies in the face of what they teach you in business school.
You know, the first thing they tell you about investing is diversify. Diversify, diversify. Spread your money across tons of stocks. Well, Munger called that idea madness. His approach, focus investing, is the exact opposite. His logic was simple. Really great investment ideas are incredibly rare. So when you find one, why on earth would you just put a tiny bit of money in it? No, you concentrate your bets.
And this brings us to my favorite Munger concept. Sit on your ass investing. Seriously, that's his term. It's the art of doing absolutely nothing. Instead of constantly buying and selling, they buy a fantastic business at a decent price, and then they just wait. They'd rather make one big, smart decision and then let compounding do all the heavy lifting for years or even decades.
So you might be thinking, what's the mistake for a guy like Munger? Buying a stock that tanks? Nope, not even close. For him, the biggest, most gut-wrenching errors were the mistakes of omission. These were the amazing companies they understood, they knew were cheap, and then, for whatever reason, they just didn't pull the trigger. Those are the mistakes that cost billions, and they don't even show up on a balance sheet.
And this really gets at the core paradox of Munger's thinking, right? You have to have incredible patience, but you also have to be ready to act in a split second. These fat pitches, as they call them, don't come around often, and they don't last long. The only way you can be ready to swing is by having a prepared mind, by spending your whole life learning, so when the perfect opportunity finally shows up, you actually recognize it.
So when you operate with this level of discipline and rationality, you can't help but look at the rest of the financial world and, well, see a lot of nonsense. And Charlie Munger, he was not afraid to call it out.
Okay, this might be one of the most famous Mungerisms of all time. Now, EBITDA stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. It's this metric that companies love to use, but Munger saw it as a trick, a way to ignore very real costs to make a business look way more profitable than it actually is. To him, it wasn't a useful metric. It was just bullshit earnings.
And oh boy, his list of things he hated did not stop there. He went after creative accounting, calling it a curse. He hated the incentives in money management that force people to pretend they can predict the future. He thought stock options were a dishonest way to hide expenses. And he saved some of his best insults for derivatives, which he saw as an insanely irresponsible system that was creating a moral sewer in the heart of capitalism.
And look, this next one is a little colorful, but it perfectly captures his view of modern finance. He saw Wall Street taking legitimate business activities, the raisins, and mixing them with all this wild, reckless speculation, the turds. And his point was, once you mix them, the whole thing is ruined. You've still just got turds. But here's the thing about Munger. He was so much more than just an investor. He was a true polymath, pulling ideas from psychology, history, physics, everywhere to build a framework for living a better, more rational life. So let's get into some of his core mental models. And for Munger, it all started here. This was the one thing that was absolutely non-negotiable if you wanted to be wise. You have to read, constantly, voraciously. He said he'd never met a wise person who didn't read all the time. None. Zero. It was the absolute foundation of everything else.
So when some young person asked him, "Hey Charlie, how do I get rich?" his answer had nothing to do with stock tips. It was all about character and discipline. It's about going to bed a little bit smarter each night. It's about just showing up and doing your job well. You just have to slug it out, one day at a time, preparing yourself so that when one of those rare opportunities finally shows up, you're actually ready for it. And I love this one because he applies one of his favorite thinking tools, something called inversion, to one of life's biggest decisions. Instead of asking, "How can I find a great partner?" you invert it. You ask, "What kind of person would a great partner want to be with?" The answer is simple: become that person. The key isn't to go out and search for what you want. It's to deserve what you want.
And that really brings us full circle to what might be the single most important Mungerism of them all, this idea of not fooling yourself. It sounds so simple, but it is so incredibly hard and so incredibly rare. Munger believed it was the bedrock of a successful life. So the question he leaves us with is, in a world that's practically designed to help you fool yourself, how much of an advantage could you get just by being rigorously, brutally honest?
Welcome to The Explainer. You know, most commencement speeches are all about the roadmap to success, right? Well, today, we're going to flip that completely on its head. We're diving into this really unusual speech from 1986 that gives you a guaranteed step-by-step guide to making your life absolutely miserable.
Okay, so let's just start with that big question. You know the one. It's at the back of everyone's mind, especially when you're starting something new. How do I actually build a good life? And man, that question can feel just huge, totally overwhelming.
Well, the speaker of this speech, the legendary investor Charlie Munger, he came up with a pretty radical solution. He basically argued that the best way to be happy isn't to chase happiness at all. No. Instead, you figure out exactly what makes people unhappy, and then you just avoid doing that stuff. It's this completely backwards approach, but trust me, as we're about to see, it is so powerful. Okay, let's get into it.
And you know, Munger didn't just pull this idea out of thin air. He actually built his whole talk on a foundation that was laid by another master, the one and only Johnny Carson. Turns out, years before Munger, Carson had given a speech on this exact same topic, laying out his own personal, time-tested recipes for a miserable life.
All right, so let's start with Carson's original formula. You could call it Misery 101. Think of these as the 3 most common, most powerful poisons you can pour into your life if, your goal is to be unhappy.
And here they are, the big 3. Number 1, ingesting chemicals to alter your mood. A really deceptive path that promises a quick fix, but just leads to ruin. Number 2, envy. That one's as old as time itself. And number 3, resentment. That habit that just takes a hard life and makes it 10 times harder. Okay, let's look at each of these.
So on the topic of chemicals, Munger gets really personal, and it's a stark warning. He says the real danger with addiction is how sneaky it is. And he shares this absolutely heartbreaking story of his 4 closest friends growing up. Alcohol was a factor in the deaths of 2 of them. A third became what he called a living alcoholic. It really drives home this point that the bonds of addiction, they feel so light at first you barely notice them, until one day they're just too strong to break.
Okay, next up, envy. Munger has this great line where he says, envy is the only deadly sin that isn't any fun. And it really thrives in that toxic space between our own messy, complicated lives and the perfect, polished highlight reel we see from everyone else. And he makes this funny point. Envy was making people miserable long before the 10 Commandments even told us it was a bad idea. And that brings us to Carson's third ingredient for a miserable life, resentment. To make his point, Munger borrows a brilliant quote from the writer Samuel Johnson. The idea is simple. Holding a grudge doesn't really hurt the other person. All it does is force you to swallow this bitter poison, making your own life, which is already hard enough, even tougher.
Okay, so that was Carson's starter pack from Misery. But Munger doesn't stop there. He adds his own 4 prescriptions to the list. This is where we go from amateur-level unhappiness to like a professional, world-class level of failure.
Now, these 4 are a little more subtle, but Munger says they're every bit as destructive. So, what are they? First, be totally unreliable. Second, make sure you only learn from your own painful mistakes, never from anyone else's. Third, the moment things get tough, just give up. And number 4 is this big, crucial mental mistake, and we're going to get to that one in just a bit. So let's talk about being unreliable. Munger is crystal clear on this. It is a killer flaw. He says it's so powerful that it will cancel out every other good quality you have. You could be the most brilliant, talented, charming person in the world, but if people can't count on you, you will get left in the dust by people who are way less talented but are just dependable. He has this amazing image for it. You'll be outrun by hordes of mediocre turtles.
His next rule for guaranteeing misery? Insist on learning everything the hard way. Why bother learning from someone else's stupid mistakes when you can go out and make them all yourself, right? This means you just proudly ignore the gigantic library of human failures out there, all those cautionary tales about what not to do.
But of course, if you actually want to succeed in life, you've got to do the exact opposite. Just look at someone like Sir Isaac Newton. He had that famous line about how he saw farther because he stood on the shoulders of giants. He didn't try to figure out physics all by himself from square one. No, he obsessively studied and mastered everything that came before him, and that's what gave him the foundation to make his own incredible breakthroughs. Okay, Munger's third prescription for misery really gets to the heart of resilience, or, I guess, the total lack of it. Look, life is going to knock you down. That's a guarantee. And if you are truly committed to being miserable, the key is this. When you get hit with that first really bad, gut-wrenching failure, you have to stay down. Whatever you do, don't get back up. And that brings us to Munger's last, and honestly, his most powerful prescription for a life of failure. This is the big one. It's really the core idea of the entire speech. It's like the master key that, if you misuse it, will lock the door to wisdom forever. And it all kicks off with this simple, kind of funny bit of wisdom from an old country fellow. All I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there. Now, if you want to guarantee misery for yourself, you have to hear that and just dismiss it as a dumb joke. You have to completely miss the incredibly powerful mental tool that's hidden right inside that sentence.
So what is that mental tool? It's called inversion. And it's all about flipping a problem completely on its head. So instead of asking, how do I succeed, you ask the opposite question. What would guarantee that I fail? Then you make a list of all the dumb mistakes, all the potential disasters, all the things that lead to ruin. And you just make it your mission to avoid those things.
And what's so wild is that this isn't some goofy self-help trick. This is a serious, rigorous mental method that some of the greatest minds in history have used. We're talking about the great algebraist Jacobi, Charles Darwin,
Albert Einstein, these guys used inversion to crack incredibly difficult problems and, just as important, to keep themselves from making huge, catastrophic mistakes in their own thinking.
So there you have it. The ultimate key to a miserable life, the one that really holds all the others together, is to just reject this whole idea of objectivity and self-criticism. Just cling stubbornly to your first ideas. Go out of your way to ignore anything that proves you wrong. You want to become that person who is so close-minded that people say you couldn't squeeze a dime between what they already know and what they'll never learn.
Okay, so after leading us down this very detailed, very specific path to a miserable life, Munger finally pulls back the curtain, and he shows us the real reason for this whole bizarre exercise.
And the antidote? Well, of course, it's just to invert the advice one more time. You just do the exact opposite of everything we just talked about. And the core message here is actually super empowering. It's that success isn't really about being some kind of born genius. It's about building skills and habits that anyone can learn. Things like being hyper-reliable, learning from others, getting back up when you fall, and just thinking clearly.
And to wrap it all up, he doesn't just give us another list of rules. He gives us a positive vision for a good life. And he does it by quoting these incredible opening lines from Rudyard Kipling's famous poem, If. It's really like a timeless guide for how to keep your head on straight when everything around you is falling apart.
In this last verse from the poem, man, it just perfectly captures the whole spirit of the antidote. It's all about discipline, trusting yourself, and making every single second count. These are the exact virtues that are the polar opposite of those 7 recipes for misery that he laid out so clearly.
So here's the final takeaway. Knowing what to avoid is often way more powerful than knowing what to chase. A good life isn't just about running towards success. It's about systematically and intelligently steering clear of failure. Munger has literally handed you the map to Miseryville. So the only question left is, where will you choose not to go?
So what if I told you the secret to being a great investor has almost nothing to do with mastering the stock market? Sounds a little crazy, right? But that was the absolute core belief of one of the greatest investors in history, Charlie Munger. You see, for him, stock picking was just one small piece of a much, much bigger puzzle, what he called the art of worldly wisdom. So how do we even begin to build that kind of wisdom? Well, lucky for us, Munger laid out a pretty clear path to follow.
And that path kicks off with something he loved to call Grandma's Rule. It's a really simple, but man, is it a profound idea. You have to eat your carrots before you get dessert. So for us, the carrots are the big foundational concepts of general worldly wisdom. The dessert, well, that's applying all that wisdom to the fun part, the art of investing. Let's start with those carrots.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start by building Munger's Latticework of Models and then really try to understand the psychology that drives reality. After that, it's dessert time. We'll look at the market as a racetrack, learn the discipline of the 20-slot punch card, unpack the famous Berkshire system, and then we'll wrap it all up with a final killer piece of wisdom from Munger himself. So, first up, the Latticework of Models. This is Munger's #1 principle of worldly wisdom. He basically said that you can't truly know anything if you're just memorizing isolated facts. That knowledge needs a structure, a framework to hang on, or it's pretty much useless. Munger calls this all-important structure the latticework.
Now, the way he illustrates the danger of not having that latticework is just brilliant. You've probably heard this saying, if you only have 1 or 2 models in your head, let's say from just one academic field, you're going to fall victim to this classic trap. You will literally torture reality to make it fit the one tool you have. And that, in Munger's own words, is a perfectly disastrous way to think.
So let's just compare these 2 ways of thinking, side by side. You've got the hammer approach over on the left. It uses just 1, maybe 2 models and tries to jam every problem into them, which leads to massive blind spots. But then, on the right, you have the latticework approach. This is all about pulling in multiple models from a ton of different disciplines. We're talking concepts like compounding from math, natural selection from biology, or cognitive dissonance from psychology. This lets you hang all your experiences on a really robust mental structure and lets you see the world as it actually is. And here's the best part, the thing that makes this whole idea achievable. You don't have to be an expert in everything. No way. Munger believed that just 80 to 90 of the most important models will do about 90% of the heavy lifting for you. All you need is a good toolkit with the most powerful concepts. And maybe the most powerful and yet most overlooked of all these concepts comes from psychology.
Which brings us to our second carrot, the psychology of reality.
Munger said this subject is just ungodly important, but it's so often ignored. And why is it so important? Well, because if you don't understand the quirks of your own mind, its shortcuts, its biases, it can turn you into a real patsy for other people, or even for your own worst instincts.
He actually called this field the psychology of misjudgment. It's basically the study of the standard, predictable ways our brains tend to mess things up. You see, our minds are built to take these little shortcuts to save energy. But those same shortcuts often cause us to see things that just aren't there, or to jump to completely wrong conclusions. Understanding these cognitive glitches is absolutely vital if you want to think rationally.
So, what's one of the most powerful psychological forces out there? The one that really drives human behavior and misjudgment? According to Munger, it all boils down to one simple thing: incentives. He famously said, "Show me the incentive, and I will show you the outcome." And he had this perfect story to illustrate.
Okay, this Federal Express story is the perfect example of the power of incentives. They had this massive problem. Their night shift couldn't get packages sorted on time, and it was threatening their whole business. And as you can see, their first attempts to fix it, giving lectures, making threats, they all failed miserably. The big breakthrough came when they understood the competing incentives. The company wanted speed, but the employees, who were paid by the hour, had zero reason to hurry. So what was the solution? Align the incentives. They started paying people by the shift, not the hour, and let them go home as soon as the work was done. The result was just, bam, the problems vanished, literally overnight. That is the power of getting incentives right.
All right, we've eaten our carrots. We get the need for a latticework of mental models, and we understand just how critical psychology is. Now, it's time for the dessert, applying all this elementary worldly wisdom to the specific game of stock picking.
Now, Munger's favorite way to think about the stock market wasn't some complex formula from an economics textbook. Not at all. He saw it as a giant racetrack, one that operates under a very specific system for setting the odds. And if you can understand this system, you'll understand why a fantastic company can sometimes be a truly terrible investment.
That system is called the pari-mutuel system. Think about it. At a horse race, the odds on a horse aren't set by the track owner, they're set by all the people betting. The more money that gets bet on a horse, the lower its payout becomes. Well, Munger argued the stock market is exactly the same. The collective bets of all investors are what set the price of a stock. And price is just another word for the odds.
Let's break this down. It's so simple, but so powerful. Any fool can look at a racetrack and see that the favorite horse, the one with the amazing record, is the most likely to win. And any fool can look at the stock market and see that a wonderful business is, better than a struggling one. But that is only half the story. The real question is about the odds, the price. The favorite horse might only pay out 3-2, while some long shot pays 100-1. It's the same with stocks. The great business sells at a really high price, while the troubled one is dirt cheap. All of a sudden, because of the price, it's incredibly hard to know which one is the better bet.
Okay, so if the market is this incredibly difficult pari-mutuel system, how on earth do you win? For Munger, the answer was radical. It was about extreme selectivity and betting big. The wise investor doesn't play every single race. No, they wait and wait for that rare, mispriced opportunity, and then they go all in.
The insight here is just so simple, but so few people get it. I mean, think about the very few people who actually make a living betting on horses. What do? They don't bet on every race. Of course not. They study and analyze, and they just wait patiently. They might only find a few really good mispriced bets in an entire year, but when they find one, they bet heavily. This is the complete opposite of how most of the investment world operates, with all its constant buying and selling.
This entire philosophy can really be boiled down to a single powerful number. A number that just forces you to completely change how you think about investing. And here it is, the central metaphor from Munger's partner Warren Buffett. Just imagine you were given a punch card with only 20 slots on it, and those 20 punches represent every single investment you get to make for your entire life. Once you punch all 20, that's it, you're done. If those were the rules, you would think incredibly hard about every single decision, right? You'd wait for the absolute no-brainers, the ideas you have the highest possible conviction in, and you would load up. You would do so much better. Now, this whole philosophy of concentration and betting big led Munger and Buffett to evolve their strategy. They started out as what you'd call classic value investors, but they eventually realized the real money, the truly big money, wasn't just in buying cheap stuff, it was in buying great stuff. And this became the Berkshire Hathaway system. This slide really shows the crucial shift in their thinking. The old-school Ben Graham approach on the left was kind of like running a Geiger counter over the market's rubble. You're looking to buy fair businesses at wonderful, dirt-cheap prices. The evolved Berkshire system is the exact opposite. It's about finding wonderful businesses, companies with these durable, long-lasting competitive advantages, and being willing to pay a fair price for them. They realize that a truly great business, even at a fair price, can be an unbelievable bargain because it just keeps compounding your wealth for decades. This leads to what Munger, in his own blunt way, called the advantage of sitting on your ass. And the practical benefits are just enormous. When you buy a few great things and you just hold on, you pay way less in fees and commissions, and you listen to way less of the distracting market nonsense. The great business itself does all the hard compounding work for you, and maybe most importantly, the tax system gives you this huge tailwind. By not selling and deferring capital gains for years or decades, your effective annual return gets a massive boost. It's an advantage that is just so often overlooked.
Which brings us to our final section. You know, after all this talk about mental models and markets and investing systems, Munger's ultimate advice really comes back to a much simpler, more profound idea. It's not about being a genius. It's about consistently avoiding common, stupid mistakes, over and over again.
So, after all this, after building a latticework of models, understanding our own psychological quirks, and learning how to bet selectively on wonderful businesses, what is the single most important lesson that Munger wanted us to take away from it all?
It's this. The real goal isn't some sudden flash of brilliance. It's a daily commitment to learning. Spend each and every day just trying to be a little bit wiser than you were when you woke up. Munger believed that if you just slug it out, 1 inch at a time, day after day, and you live long enough, you will get out of life what you deserve. And that, right there, is the ultimate lesson on elementary worldly wisdom.
All right, welcome. Today we're going to dive into one of the most powerful frameworks for practical thinking ever put together. And it comes from Charlie Munger's classic speech, A Lesson on Elementary Worldly Wisdom. And look, this isn't just about investing. It's really a blueprint for building a mind that can navigate reality way more effectively than pretty much anyone else.
So let's just jump right into the central question that Munger asks. This is really the heart of our entire explainer. How do you get there? And this is the key thing, right? It's not about having some genius-level IQ. It's about developing a very specific kind of practical, real-world wisdom. So how do you do it? Well, Munger believed he had a system, and that's exactly what we're going to unpack. To answer that huge question, we've got to go on a bit of a quest for wisdom ourselves. And it all starts with understanding Munger's most foundational concept, the one tool he believed was absolutely essential for clear thinking.
And here we have it, the Latticework of Mental Models. You know, the idea sounds simple, but trust me, the implications are absolutely massive. Munger's argument is that you just can't rely on knowledge from one single field. You have to go out and collect the big, time-tested ideas from all sorts of disciplines, physics, biology, history, psychology, and then hang them on a framework in your own mind. It's like having a full, versatile toolkit for your brain, instead of just walking around with a single hammer.
Okay, but before we can even start building this amazing toolkit, we really have to understand why most of us are taught to think in a way that's, well, pretty flawed. Munger points out a gigantic problem in our education and our professional systems.
Yeah, Munger does not pull any punches here. He basically argues that the way our schools and universities organize knowledge is fundamentally broken. By separating everything into these neat, tidy departments, it actually stops us from seeing the world as it really is, a messy, interconnected system.
He calls these artificial walls jurisdictional boundaries. Just think about it. You've got the finance department over here, the marketing department over there, the physics department, the history department, and they almost never talk to each other. This chops up reality, and it trains people to only use the tools from their own little corner of the world, even when the problem in front of them desperately needs a different approach.
So, what's the solution? If the system is broken, what do? Well, Munger turns to a simple children's story. The message is clear. If the system won't teach you how to think in a multidisciplinary way, you just have to take the initiative and say, fine, I'll do it myself.
So if we've established we have to build this thing ourselves, how do we actually use it? This is where Munger's advice gets super practical. He gives us this fantastic analogy from a game you might not expect.
He uses the card game Contract Bridge, and it's a perfect metaphor. In Bridge, first you figure out your goal and you count your obvious winners, your high cards. But that's never enough to actually win the game, right? To get those extra tricks, you have to access your mental toolkit of standard techniques, things like finesses and squeezes. But here's the crucial part. It's not just about knowing what these techniques are, it's about knowing when to use them and how they interact with each other to get you the win. Munger says life and business are exactly the same.
And in classic Munger style, he really drives the point home with a phrase you won't forget. Relying on just one or two mental models is just a recipe for disaster. You know the saying, to the man with only a hammer, every problem looks like a nail? Well, that is a really dangerous way to navigate a complex world.
It really boils down to this. Just like a great card player, you have to learn to think things through. Not just forwards, asking, how can I win? But also backwards, asking, what could possibly go wrong here? That discipline of looking at a problem from multiple angles is a huge part of worldly wisdom.
All right, now we're getting to what Munger believes is the absolute most important discipline of them all. And ironically, it's the one that's taught and understood the most poorly: psychology. This, he says, is where you'll find some of the most powerful mental models of all.
To show you what he means, Munger tells us an incredible story about the famous linguist Noam Chomsky. Now, Chomsky is a certified genius, but his extreme political ideology caused him to completely reject a scientific conclusion just because it threatened his worldview. The lesson here is just chilling. If heavy ideology can blind a mind that brilliant, just imagine what it can do to the rest of us.
So Munger basically says that the psychology textbooks you read in college, they're totally daft. Why? Because they leave out some of the biggest, most powerful forces that actually drive human behavior. They don't properly cover our tendency to just deny reality when it's too painful. They miss how incentives totally warp our thinking. They ignore the incredible destructive power of envy, and they completely fail to account for how multiple psychological forces can combine to create these extreme outcomes.
And this just perfectly captures that idea of psychological denial. The Greek orator Demosthenes said this, and get this, over 2,000 years ago. It's a piece of wisdom that is absolutely timeless. Our minds are literally built to protect us from pain, and sometimes that means believing something that just isn't true.
And this brings us to one of his most crucial concepts, what he calls Lollapalooza effects. Think about the famous Milgram experiment, where people thought they were giving painful electric shocks to someone else. It's usually taught as a simple lesson in obeying authority, but Munger says that is dangerously simplistic. The extreme result wasn't caused by just one thing. It was caused by a combination of at least 6 different psychological principles, things like social proof, commitment and consistency bias, stress, all working together, creating this perfect storm of misjudgment.
Okay, this is an absolutely brilliant, real-world example of this in action. Captain Cook had a huge problem. He needed to get his sailors, who were dying of scurvy, to eat sauerkraut, but they flat out refused. So instead of using force, he used psychology. He made sauerkraut a high-status food by serving it only at the officer's table. And pretty soon what happened? The regular sailors started demanding their share. He used the psychological principles of social proof and scarcity to literally save their lives. That is worldly wisdom.
So, after all this hard work, after building this incredible lattice work in your mind, what's the actual payoff? Well, the answer might not be what you think. It's something called intellectual humility.
The whole point of getting this worldly wisdom isn't to become some kind of genius who can solve impossible problems. Nope, it's about getting smart enough to know which problems you should just walk away from. Munger and Buffett's incredible success comes from finding the easy, obvious opportunities, the 1-foot hurdles, not from trying to heroically leap over 7-foot fences.
And here is just a perfect example of that humility in the real world. Jack Welch, the legendary CEO of GE, was once asked for his opinion on Apple. He didn't give some long, confident answer. He simply said, "I don't have any special competence that would enable me to answer that question." He knew the exact boundaries of his expertise. That is the mark of a truly wise person.
Munger contrasts this with this great analogy of a bee. See, when a bee finds nectar in a place it's not programmed for, like straight up, it doesn't just stop. It performs this confused, incoherent dance that just messes everything up for the whole hive. Munger says a lot of people are like that bee, confidently spouting off on things they know nothing about. The wise person, like Welch, knows when it's best to just sit there and say nothing.
And really, when you think about it, this is the core lesson. What could possibly be more useful in your life than truly knowing what you know and what you don't know? It lets you operate with force and conviction where you're competent, and it tells you to stay the heck out of areas where you're not.
Look, this journey isn't a walk in the park. It takes lifelong learning and a real willingness to destroy your own most loved ideas. But Munger is so clear that the benefits, the rewards of developing this kind of wisdom, they aren't just a little better. They are, in his own words, absolutely awesome.
So, we're going to leave you with this final thought, a question for you. As you go about your day, your week, think about your own mental toolkit. Which disciplines have you been ignoring? What are the big, powerful ideas that are missing from your lattice work? Because that's where the real quest for elementary, worldly wisdom truly begins.
Let's talk about one of the great minds of our time, Charlie Munger, and a talk he gave that is just, well, it's a masterpiece of thinking. The title alone tells you we're in for a ride. Practical thought about practical thought? You see that question mark? That's our cue that we're about to go a level deeper. We're not just thinking, we're thinking about how we think.
Right out of the gate, Munger hits us with this absolutely staggering challenge. It's a thought experiment that, on the surface, sounds completely impossible. The question is, how do you take $2 million and turn it into $2 trillion? That's with a T. We're talking about a million to one return. I mean, how on earth is that even possible?
And just to make things a little spicier, he throws in a constraint. The year is 1884. We're in Atlanta, Georgia, and we can't use any knowledge of anything that happened after that year. And that little twist is just brilliant because it reveals the whole point of the exercise. This isn't about stock tips or market forecasting. It's a thinking problem. The answer isn't some secret formula. It's a whole new way of looking at the world.
Now, a quick heads up. The editor of Munger's book actually includes a warning with this speech. He says most people just don't get it, and that Munger himself felt it was a bit of a communication failure. But don't let that put you off. That's actually an invitation to lean in a little closer, you know? The fact that it's difficult is actually a huge part of the lesson.
So here's our game plan for unpacking this. First, we'll dig into that $2 trillion question. Then, we'll look at the 5 simple but incredibly powerful ideas Munger gives us as our toolkit. After that, we'll actually use them to build a pitch for an empire. Then we'll connect it to the real story, which has a jaw-dropping lesson. And finally, we'll see what this all teaches us about a better way to think.
All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty of this challenge. So, imagine it. We're back in 1884. We get a summons from this wealthy, kind of quirky guy named Glotz, and he's got a proposition for us, one that could literally change the world.
So here are the rules of the game. Glotz is putting up $2 million, which was a huge sum back then. He says the business has to be a non-alcoholic beverage company, and it can never be anything else. And he's already got the name picked out, a name he just finds charming, Coca-Cola. Our job, our only job, is to figure out how to turn that $2 million into a $2 trillion global empire by the year 2034. No big deal, right? So how do you even begin to think about a problem on that scale? It's daunting. But Munger doesn't just leave us hanging. He gives us a mental toolkit. It's a set of 5 incredibly simple ideas that, when you put them together, are just profoundly powerful.
First step, simplify. Just tackle the big, obvious, no-brainer questions first. Get those out of the way. Second, use numbers. Get comfortable with math so you can understand the scale of what you're dealing with. Third, invert. This is a big one. As a famous mathematician once said, invert, always invert. Think about what you want to avoid. Fourth, think multidisciplinary. The world isn't neatly divided into subjects, so your thinking shouldn't be either. And fifth, you gotta hunt for the Lollapalooza effects. These are the moments where a bunch of different factors combine to create a result that is just explosive.
And this quote right here, it just perfectly captures why that 4th idea is so crucial. If your only tool is a hammer, if you only think like an economist or only like an engineer, you're going to get things wrong. Real-world problems are messy. They're not just nails. They're screws and bolts and weird custom fasteners you've never seen before. You need a full toolkit.
Okay, so we've got our 5 tools. Now it's time to walk into Glotz's office and make our pitch. We've got 15 minutes. Let's see if we can use these 5 simple notions to build the Coca-Cola empire from the ground up with nothing but 1884 knowledge.
Let's start with tool number 2, numerical fluency. A $2 trillion company sounds like fantasy, but is it arithmetically possible? Well, Munger does some quick napkin math. He figures by 2034, we'll have about 8 billion people on the planet. If our company can just get them to drink a tiny fraction of what they already drink every day, we could sell something like 2.92 trillion servings a year. And if we make just 4 cents a profit on each one, boom, that's over $100 billion in profit a year. Suddenly, this crazy goal actually looks doable.
Okay, now for some multidisciplinary thinking. We need to borrow an idea from psychology.
What business are we really in? Munger says it's simple. We are in the business of creating and maintaining conditioned reflexes. We want the brand Coca-Cola to be the trigger, and we want the automatic response to be buy it and drink it.
And lucky for us, Psychology 101 gives us two super powerful ways to do this. First, there's operant conditioning. That's all about reward. You drink the Coke, it tastes good, you get a little kick from the sugar and caffeine, that's a reward, and it makes you want to do it again. Then you have Pavlovian conditioning. That's all about association. Your brain sees Coke paired with happy times, fun events, attractive people, and it starts to link the brand itself with those good feelings. Now, here's the secret sauce, the Lollapalooza effect. You don't just use one, you use both, fanatically, all the time.
So how do we make this the ultimate reward? Well, we basically load the product with everything that works. We put in sugar for a quick energy boost, we add caffeine for that little pick-me-up, we serve it cold so it's refreshing, we work relentlessly to find a unique flavor that people just love, and this part is absolutely critical, we make it available everywhere. Why? Because if a customer can't get our product, they might try something else and form a new habit. We can't have that.
All right, now for the Pavlovian magic. This is where branding and advertising come into play. And Munger, well, he doesn't mince words. This quote gets right to the heart of it. It's about raw, powerful, primal association. Our job is to connect the idea of Coca-Cola with everything our customers already love and admire.
And this thinking shapes the entire product. The name itself, Coca-Cola, sounds a little exotic, a little sophisticated. We'll make the drink dark to look more like a fine wine than plain old sugar water. We'll add carbonation to give it the exciting fizz of champagne. And that unique flavor we talked about, it's not just for reward. It's so the taste can't be confused with anything else. Every single detail is an exercise in Pavlovian engineering.
Now we get to my favorite tool. Invert, always invert. Instead of asking how to succeed, let's ask, what could absolutely destroy this empire? First, a bad aftertaste. People won't drink a lot of it. The solution? Create a flavor that cleans up nice, so you immediately want another sip. Second, what if we lose our brand name? That's a disaster. Solution? We protect that trademark like it's the crown jewels. Third, what if people get jealous of our success? Solution? We have to deserve it with fanatical quality control and fair prices. And fourth, and this one is so important, we can never make a sudden drastic change to the flavor. Why? Because that would trigger something Munger calls Deprival-Super reaction. And trust me, people go crazy when you take away something they love.
So, there you have it. That's our hypothetical pitch to old Mr. Glotz, all built on 5 simple ideas. But here's where it gets really mind-blowing. Let's look at how closely this theoretical plan lines up with the actual history of Coca-Cola and the deep, deep lesson that Munger pulls out of it.
The real Coca-Cola company became absolute masters of Pavlovian conditioning. I mean, just look at this quote from Dwight Eisenhower during World War II. Coke stopped being just a soft drink. Through brilliant association, it became a symbol of home, of comfort, of America itself. You literally cannot buy advertising that powerful.
And what about that rule to never ever change the flavor? Well, in 1985, the real company did exactly that. They launched New Coke because it kept winning in blind taste tests. I mean, from a purely rational, flavor is everything perspective, it seemed like a no-brainer. But they completely forgot about the psychology, and the public went ballistic. It was a perfect example of that Deprival-Super reaction Munger talked about. People were hoarding old Coke, protesting. The backlash was so huge that the company had to reverse course in just 79 days. And this, right here, is the core of Munger's entire argument. The New Coke fiasco wasn't just some marketing oopsie. He sees it as a profound educational failure. How could all these brilliant, top-of-their-class executives, with the best consultants money could buy, make a mistake that was so psychologically obvious? And that finally brings us to the real reason for this whole thought experiment. It's not about selling soda. It's a powerful critique of how we are all taught to think and a prescription for a much, much better way. Munger says our modern education system has 2 massive flaws. The first is what he calls a lack of intradisciplinary synthesis. So even within one subject, like psychology, we don't learn it as a connected web of ideas. We just get a list of disconnected experiments. We never learn how all these effects combine to create those huge Lollapalooza outcomes. The second and much worse flaw is a lack of interdisciplinary synthesis. We build these giant walls between academic departments, creating experts who are geniuses in one tiny area but are totally blind to the most basic, powerful ideas from other fields. So what's the antidote? It's to adopt the mindset of a Darwin or an Einstein. It's about developing a kind of ruthless objectivity,
especially about your own ideas. Darwin literally spent his life trying to disprove his own theories. Einstein said self-criticism was just as important as curiosity or perseverance. It's about actively going out and finding wisdom from all fields, especially the ones that challenge your current beliefs.
And that leaves us with this final, really important question. The story of Coca-Cola shows us the enormous price you can pay for thinking in narrow, specialized silos. But if you invert that, it also shows us the incredible opportunities that are just waiting for people who can break out of them. So, I'll leave you with this to chew on. What Lollapalooza effects are hiding in plain sight in your world, just waiting for a multidisciplinary mind to come along and connect the dots?
Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're going to dig into a really powerful talk by the one and only Charlie Munger. Now, this is a deep critique of how our best universities teach people to think, and honestly, it offers a pretty radical solution for upgrading our own mental software to achieve what he calls true worldly wisdom. And it all kicks off with this wild question. I mean, think about it. What could a place like Harvard possibly learn from how we train airplane pilots? Well, as we're about to find out, Munger's answer is pretty much everything that actually matters when you're making big decisions in a really complex world. So Munger starts with this zinger from George Bernard Shaw. And what Shaw is getting at here is that professions, doctors, lawyers, academics, they tend to build these invisible walls around themselves. They create their own language, they protect their own turf, and they basically promote their own little slice of the world, often shutting everybody else out. But to really get what Munger's talking about, we have to first understand the core problem he's trying to solve. He calls it the one-hammer problem. And it's all about how really, really smart people, specialists at the top of their game, can end up with these huge, dangerous blind spots that cause them to make just awful mistakes. And if you want to see how bad this can get, just look at this story from history. Back in the 16th century, the clergy pretty much ran the show. So when this guy, William Tyndale, dared to translate the Bible into plain English so regular people could read it, he was threatening their total control over knowledge. And for that, they had him killed. That is professional turf protection at its absolute most brutal. Now, Munger says that today, the issue isn't usually some evil, conscious conspiracy. No, it's way more subtle than that. And in a lot of ways, it's actually more dangerous. He says it all comes down to two powerful subconscious biases that are hardwired into our brains, and they just twist our judgment without us even noticing. And here are the two culprits. On one hand, you've got incentive-caused bias. This is that little voice in our head that convinces us that what's good for our career is magically good for everyone else too. Think about it. A surgeon is probably going to suggest surgery, right? Then you've got the more famous one, the man with a hammer tendency. But the real problem, and this is key, is how these two feed off each other. Your incentives push you to use your specialized hammer, and because you're always using that hammer, you start to see every single problem in the world as a nail. It creates this vicious cycle of narrow-mindedness that is so hard to escape. Okay, so how in the world do we fix this? Well, Munger tells us to look at a field where the stakes couldn't possibly be higher, a place where one little mistake is a catastrophe, and where they absolutely cannot afford to have the man with a hammer problem. And that is pilot training. And he does not mince words. He's saying that this system, built for the life-or-death world of aviation, actually holds the secrets for creating real expertise in any field, whether you're a CEO, a doctor, a lawyer, whatever. So what is this gold standard system? Well, it's built on 6 key pillars. First, the education is super broad. It covers everything a pilot might need. Second, that knowledge is drilled into them until it's second nature, not just something you cram for a test. Third, they learn to think both forwards, how do I succeed, and backwards, what are the critical mistakes I absolutely have to avoid. Fourth, they practice the most important skills the most. Fifth, they use mandatory checklists every single time, which forces a disciplined approach. And finally, they're constantly in simulators, keeping those skills sharp. It's a whole system designed to produce reliable judgment under pressure. Okay, so you've got that incredible system on one side. How does it compare to what's actually happening in our top universities? Well, according to Munger, it's not even close. He says the central problem is something the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead called the fatal unconnectedness of disciplines. You see, Whitehead realized that knowledge in universities was being chopped up into these little isolated kingdoms, these departments that don't talk to each other. The economists are over here, the psychologists are over there, and the biologists are in another building entirely.
This is the complete opposite of that integrated pilot training model. It's a system that's almost perfectly designed to churn out an army of people with hammers. Now, to be fair, academia has tried to fix this. They've got this approach Munger calls take what you wish, where different fields can borrow ideas from each other. And sometimes it works great. Law schools started using ideas from economics. Economics borrowed the tragedy of the commons idea from biology. But this unstructured free-for-all also led to some major disasters. Lit departments got obsessed with some pretty shaky Freudian ideas, and business schools went all in on the efficient market theory, a model Munger says is just flat out wrong and helped cause financial crises. You see, without a rigorous system, take what you wish can import nonsense just as easily as it imports wisdom. So if that's the wrong way to do it, what's Munger's big idea? Well, lucky for us, he lays out 5 very specific, concrete steps that our top universities could take to get on the right track towards a truly effective, multidisciplinary education. So here's the game plan. First, just like with pilots, make more core classes mandatory so everyone has the same foundational knowledge. Second, make students solve problems that force them to use tools from different fields. Third, use real-world examples from business journals as a kind of flight simulator for the brain. Fourth, teach people how to avoid being blinded by their own political passions. And fifth, and this is the big one, imitate the core principles of the hard sciences. And that second point, cross-disciplinary problem solving, is so powerful. Check out this story. A Harvard Business School professor gives his class this complicated case about a failing shoe factory owned by 2 elderly ladies. The students write these long, brilliant essays using all their fancy business school models, but the professor only gives 1 A grade, and it was for a super short answer. Just sell the factory. Why? Because that student didn't just use their business hammer, they used fundamental ideas from other fields like economics and psychology to realize that for these 2 ladies, the hassle and risk of trying to fix the factory just wasn't worth it. That is worldly wisdom.
And this brings us right to Munger's final and, I think, his most important recommendation. He says that the softer sciences, and really all professionals, should just copy the rigorous, organized way of thinking that has made the hard sciences like physics and chemistry so incredibly successful. And the beautiful thing is, this ethos isn't some vague idea. You can actually boil it all down to 4 fundamental rules for organizing your knowledge and thinking rationally. Okay, so here are the rules. 1, you have to rank disciplines by how fundamental they are. Physics is at the bottom, chemistry is built on top of that, and so on. 2, you have to master the basics of those most fundamental fields. 3, you always have to look for the most fundamental explanation, and you have to give credit where you got the idea from, no cherry picking. And 4, you can't just make up new theories that violate the old, proven ones. See? This forces you to be rational and honest, a total world away from the chaos of take what you wish. Now, if you're thinking, does this stuff actually work? Just listen to this. It's an absolutely stunning admission from Munger himself. The guy never took a formal class in any of these major fields. He just used this hard science ethos to teach himself, and he became one of the greatest investors and thinkers of all time. He essentially built his own university inside his own head, and the incredible implication here is that so can we. So that leaves one big question, right? If this way of thinking is so much better, why do our best universities stick with the old, broken model? Munger's answer is simple and a little cynical. It's all about perverse incentives. Academic departments want to protect their budgets, their power, their prestige. As he says, it's really hard to see a truth when your paycheck depends on you not seeing it. But here is the glimmer of hope. If the problem is created by man-made incentives, well, then the solution is in our hands too. These aren't laws of physics. They're choices, and we can always make different choices. So to wrap things up, Munger leaves us with a fantastic, practical tool that you and I can start using immediately. He calls it 2-track analysis. It's simple. Whenever you're looking at a problem, you analyze it on 2 separate tracks. First, you look at the rational stuff, the economics, the numbers, the cold, hard facts. But then, and this is just as important, you have to look at the second track, the subconscious, psychological forces at play, the biases, the instincts, the emotions that are really driving people's behavior. You have to understand both to see the full picture. You know, we've covered some really big ideas here. The man with the hammer, the pilot training model, the hard science ethos, 2-track analysis. But the real question Munger leaves us with is a personal one. Now that you've seen these powerful tools, which one are you actually going to pick up and add to your own mental toolbox?
All right, today we're going to deconstruct an absolute masterclass in clear thinking from the one and only Charlie Munger. We're digging into a speech he gave back in 1998, but wow, is it more relevant than ever? He basically delivered this devastating takedown of the investment world, arguing that most big charitable foundations are just systematically lighting their own money on fire. And, you know, Munger, he was not afraid to name names.
So Munger boils this whole debate down to a really simple but powerful choice. He says you're either going to follow Ben Franklin, the model of wisdom, simplicity, and being a long-term owner of businesses you really admire, or you're going to follow Bernie Kornfeld, the disgraced salesman whose entire legacy is a system built on complexity, crazy high costs, and just layers upon layers of fees. For Munger, this isn't just about two different styles. It's a moral choice. It's about whether your foundation is actually serving its mission or just making an army of middlemen rich.
And, in classic Munger style, he just completely disarms everyone right at the start by making fun of himself. But by pointing the finger at his younger self, he's doing more than just being humble. The real point he's making is this. Look, I get it. I came from a system with messed up incentives too, and I figured out a better way. It's basically an invitation to everyone in the room to look at their own models and realize, hey, a better path is possible for you too.
So here's how we're going to break down his argument. We'll walk through 6 key steps. We'll start with those 2 competing models, then dig into the crazy hidden costs of complexity and the psychological traps that get everyone. After that, he shows us a way out, the 3 different paths a foundation can take, why he's such a huge fan of concentration, and finally, the big ethical choice at the heart of it all. First up, a tale of 2 models. Let's really get a handle on the problem Munger saw happening. He noticed the slow, almost invisible drift in how America's biggest foundations were handling their money. A shift away from a simple system that worked toward something way, way more problematic. What blew Munger's mind was this. Years after Bernie Kornfeld's whole fund of funds empire totally collapsed in a massive scandal, he was seeing its core ideas being brought back to life. And not just anywhere, by the most prestigious, respected institutions in the country. This model, with all its different layers of managers all taking a slice of the pie, was suddenly being treated like gospel by the very universities and foundations that should have known better. It was, as Munger saw it, a total triumph of salesmanship over substance. Okay, but for Munger, this isn't just some abstract intellectual debate. It's about the money. So he followed the money. And what he found was that all this complexity wasn't just confusing. It was creating this massive hidden drain on the very money these foundations were supposed to be protecting for the public good. He lays out this whole Rube Goldberg machine of fees. So first, you've got the foundation itself. Then they hire consultants to help them pick the best managers. Then those consultants go and hire a bunch of different investment counselors. And then those counselors, they rely on research from super expensive analysts at the big banks. Every layer adds another meeting, another report, but more importantly, as you can see, every single layer takes a cut. And Munger actually puts a number on it. He figures that when you add everything up, the management fees, the consultant fees, all the trading costs, the total, what he calls the croupier's take, fantastic term, right? It can easily hit 3%. 3% of the foundation's entire net worth gone every single year. A lot of the time it's kind of hidden in the accounting, but believe me, it is very real. And this is where the math gets, pretty brutal. Let's just say, in a pretty normal market, you get a 5% real return on your money. Now, take out that 3% for the croupiers, and then you have to take out the 5% that the foundation is legally required to donate every year. What are you left with? A negative 3% return. In a world of just okay returns, this system is a mathematical guarantee that the foundation's actual spending power will shrink over time. It's designed to fail. So you're probably asking, if the math is this bad, why on earth does anybody do this? Well, Munger's answer is that it's not really a math problem. It's a human problem, and it's rooted in one of our most dangerous biases, overconfidence. He reaches all the way back to the ancient Greeks for this one. Demosthenes said it perfectly. What a man wishes, he will believe. It's just human nature. Every single person on a foundation board wishes they're smart enough to pick the superstar managers who will beat the market. Every consultant wishes they have that secret sauce. And because they want it to be true so badly, Munger says they just start believing it's true, no matter what the evidence says. This is just perfectly illustrated by that classic study, right? 90% of Swedish drivers said they were above average. I mean, come on. And Munger has this great line where he says that the self-confidence of investment counselors makes these Swedish drivers sound like depressives. It's a funny line for sure, but it makes a deadly serious point about the culture of the entire industry. And the funny thing is, Munger warns that having too much professionalism can actually make things worse. All the fancy procedures, the binders full of data, the surveys, it can create this false sense of security. He points to General Motors. They did all this professional consumer research and concluded that their new truck didn't need a fourth door. Their competitors, who just, watched how people actually use trucks, they knew better. It was a Lollapalooza of mistake, as Munger called it, that cost them hundreds of millions of dollars, and it was born from being overconfident in a bad process.
And if you're thinking, well, maybe you just need to be smarter, Munger has the perfect counterexample. Right before he gave this speech, the hedge fund Long-Term Capital Management had just spectacularly blown up. I mean, this place was run by Wall Street legends and 2 Nobel Prize-winning economists. Their IQs were literally off the charts, but their absolute total confidence in their own genius models led to a collapse so big it almost took down the entire global financial system.
So what's the answer? What do we do? Munger says we have to think like the world's best scientists, like the physicist Richard Feynman. See, the best physicists don't spend their time trying to prove themselves right. They work like crazy to prove themselves wrong. They practice what you might call extreme self-criticism, because they know, as Feynman said, that you are the easiest person to fool. And that kind of intellectual honesty is exactly what Munger thinks is missing from the investment world. Okay, so if you're a foundation and you've bought into this idea of intellectual honesty, what do you actually do? Munger says there are basically 3 ways to go, a real fork in the road that leads away from that high-cost, complicated mess. All right, path number 1 is indexing. Super simple. You fire the consultants, you stop all the frantic trading, and you just accept the market's return for a tiny, tiny cost. For most foundations, he thinks this is a much, much better choice. Path 2 is his favorite, the Berkshire Hathaway model. You put almost all your money into a very small number of really outstanding businesses that you know inside and out, and then you do pretty much nothing. And then there's path 3. You go even deeper into complexity with things like leveraged buyout funds and venture capital. Munger is, well, let's just say he's extremely skeptical about this one, pointing out the insane competition and all the hidden risks. Now let's really zoom in on his favorite solution, the Berkshire model. Because this is where he takes a direct shot at one of the most sacred ideas in all of modern finance, massive diversification. So he throws out this question that, honestly, is almost heretical in finance. Is the conventional wisdom, the idea that you have to own dozens or even hundreds of different stocks to be safe, is that actually a mistake? For people who are truly willing to do the hard work, Munger argues that this orthodox view isn't just a little wrong, it's grossly mistaken. And you can see the 2 philosophies side by side right here. I mean, they're like night and day. The standard view says you need tons of holdings, you're constantly buying and selling, your costs are high, and you're always worrying about short-term price swings. The Berkshire view is the exact opposite. Very few holdings, almost zero turnover, extremely low costs, and this relentless focus on the long-term health of the few businesses you've chosen to own. And this isn't just a theory. He gives this incredible real-world example. The Woodruff Foundation, which was endowed by the legendary leader of Coca-Cola, had kept about 90% of its money in Coke stock for decades. Now, by any conventional measure, that's totally reckless, right? But Munger points out that by ignoring that siren song of diversification, they achieved results that were just worlds better than what almost any other foundation could even dream of. And this is the cool part. Munger ties this investment strategy directly to the guy's personal philosophy. Robert Woodruff's creed was all about achieving amazing things by not caring who got the credit for it. Think about that. It's the polar opposite of the modern investment manager, right? Their entire business model is based on taking credit for short-term results. The Woodruff philosophy is all about long-term, egoless building and compounding. And this all leads to his final point, which, by the way, isn't just about making more money. He elevates the whole conversation to a much higher level, an ethical one. He argues that this choice has consequences that go way beyond just one foundation's bank account. He makes the case that the whole high-cost, high-turnover fund-of-funds model is actually socially destructive. Why? Because it creates this giant incentive machine that sucks more and more of our country's brightest, most ethical young people into a zero-sum game of just shuffling paper assets around. Instead of becoming engineers or doctors or entrepreneurs, people who create real value for civilization, they get pulled into money management. It's a colossal waste of human talent. And so we end up right back where we started.
Munger just lays the choice out there, plain as day. Are you going to follow the Ben Franklin model, concentrate your investments in businesses you admire, keep your costs near zero, and let great companies do good in the world? Or are you going to choose the Bernie Kornfeld model, embrace complexity, constant activity, and just keep feeding that ever-growing army of croupiers? Munger's final message, and it's a powerful one, is that how we invest isn't just a financial decision, it's a statement about our values, and it's a choice about the kind of world we want to help build.
Way back in November of 2000, the stock market was flying high. I mean, dizzyingly high. And right then, the legendary investor Charlie Munger gave this lecture on a really startling economic theory. He basically argued that a hidden force was secretly pumping up the whole boom. A force he gave a name you've probably never heard: Fabesment. So what in the world is this mysterious force, and why should you care about it today? Well, let's dive in. Right, so this is the central mystery we're unpacking. Think about it. We're at the absolute peak of the dot-com bubble. All the so-called experts are celebrating this new era of endless prosperity. But Charlie Munger? He saw a ticking time bomb. He saw an economy being artificially juiced by something that acted, for all intents and purposes, just like massive undiscovered theft. While they were popping champagne, Munger was sounding the alarm. So the big question is, what did he see that everybody else just completely missed? Now, Munger's theory didn't just pop out of thin air. It was actually born from a huge economic puzzle that had all the experts totally stumped. I mean, they were scratching their heads, questioning their own textbooks. And that puzzle was Japan. You might have heard of their infamous lost decade. See, after this enormous bubble popped in the late 80s, their economy just stopped. And they did everything the economic playbook says to do. They threw massive amounts of government money at the problem, they cut interest rates to practically zero, and the result? Nothing. Crickets. The economy stayed painfully stuck in the mud. I mean, imagine a country using every tool it has and still failing. That was Japan in the 90s. And it was a huge wake-up call for anyone who thought they had economies all figured out. And then you have this guy, Charlie Munger, the ultimate outsider. He wasn't an economist, and honestly, that was his superpower. You can see from this quote, he was actually proud of it. Because he was free from all that academic dogma and groupthink, he could see things that the experts, who were kind of trapped inside their own models, were completely blind to. So Munger believed the experts were tripping over the very first clue. And the reason they were stumbling was because they completely misunderstood a key concept they thought they had locked down, something called the wealth effect. The basic idea here is pretty simple. You know how it is? You check your 401k, and suddenly it's worth way more than it was last year. You feel richer, right? So you might finally go buy that new car or take that vacation. That feeling, that's the wealth effect in action. Now, everyone agreed this was a real thing. The big debate was, just how big of a deal was it really? And this was Munger's first big bombshell. He said the wealth effect wasn't just a little bigger than the experts thought. No, it was a monster, an absolute giant. And the only reason economists were missing it was because they were looking in all the wrong places and counting all the wrong things. This example he gave just illustrates it perfectly. So picture a dentist. His GE pension plan doubles from $1 million to $2 million. He feels flush, so he goes out and leases a brand new Cadillac. Now, the official government data, which didn't track these pension gains very well, might just see this as someone irresponsibly spending their savings. But Munger saw the truth. This was a massive, uncounted wealth effect. Now just multiply that one dentist by millions of other people with their own booming pension plans. And suddenly you have this huge, secret, parallel spending boom that the official numbers weren't capturing at all. But, you know, this hidden wealth effect was really just the tip of the iceberg. Munger's real stroke of genius was connecting it all to this forgotten, almost weird economic concept from John Kenneth Galbraith, a concept with a name that sounds like something out of a Dr. Seuss book. And that name was bezel. Yep, B-E-Z-Z-L-E, bezel. It's Galbraith's term for the total amount of theft, like embezzlement, in the system that just hasn't been discovered yet. You can think of it like a ghost in the economic machine, this secret river of stolen money that's flowing completely unseen.
Okay, so here's the crazy part, the absolute magic of the bezel. As Galbraith points out, the guy who embezzles the money feels richer, so he goes out and spends it. But his employer, who has no idea the money's gone, also keeps spending just like he always did. So for a brief shining moment, you have two different people spending the exact same dollar. It's like some kind of weird economic alchemy.
Just take a look at this. On the left, you've got a totally normal transaction. One person buys a coat, money moves from one hand to another.
Simple. The net spending power in the economy is unchanged. But now, look at the right side. This is the bezel effect. The embezzler spends his stolen $20, but the company owner also spends that $20 because he still thinks it's in the bank. The money is spent twice. You've temporarily and dishonestly doubled the spending power.
And this, right here, is where Munger goes from being a brilliant observer to a true visionary. He saw the genius in Galbraith's idea, but he also saw its big, fatal flaw. And that's when he asked the question that just changed everything.
See, the big problem with old-fashioned bezel, actual embezzlement, is that it's just a sugar high. It feels great for a little while, but sooner or later the truth comes out. The theft gets discovered, the embezzler goes to jail, and the whole economic boost just slams into reverse. It is definitely not a recipe for a long-term economic boom.
And this is where Munger had his massive light bulb moment. He asked himself this critical question you see right here. What if you could get all the awesome economic power of bezel, but without the crime? What if there were totally legal ways to create the exact same economic illusion, but on a massive, nationwide scale that could last for years?
His answer was a resounding yes. He even made up his own word for it, febezel. The FE stands for functional equivalent. So, febezel is Munger's word for processes that strip away wealth, just like embezzlement does, but are perfectly legal and happen right out in the open. And he believed this was the secret engine of the dot-com boom, humming away in plain sight while almost no one even noticed it was there.
So, the big question is, where was all this massive, legal fezzlement happening? Well, Munger pointed his finger right at the one place you might least expect it, Wall Street.
He wasn't pulling any punches. He accused the entire investment management industry. We're talking the consultants, the fund managers, the whole system built to handle money for pensions and mutual funds. He argued they were systematically bleeding wealth away from investors through all kinds of excessive, totally non-productive costs. You can think of it as death by 1,000 tiny cuts. High fees, pointless trading, layers of managers, all just bleeding the life out of people's investments.
And the scale of this was just jaw-dropping. Look at this number. Munger pointed to a study showing that while the average mutual fund reported gains of almost 13% a year, the actual human being who invested in that fund only got about 7%. Just let that sink in for a second. A gap of over 5% of assets, gone, every single year. For every dollar you thought you were making, the industry was quietly taking a huge slice. It was a massive silent transfer of wealth from ordinary people to Wall Street insiders.
So how did they get away with it? Well, as you can see here, it was a whole symphony of self-interest. You had these high-cost consultants pushing ridiculously expensive funds. You had constant churn, firing and hiring managers just to generate fees. You had high-pressure sales, and in some cases, even corrupt accounting. It was a whole system designed to benefit the insiders, and it came at the direct expense of the actual owners of the money.
And here's the kicker. This is the really insidious part of it all. As Munger points out, the people doing the embezzling didn't see themselves as bad guys. They honestly thought they were virtuously earning income. But their high-flying lifestyle was being paid for by the slow, silent erosion of other people's retirements. And just like with real embezzlement, the owner, the pension fund, still felt rich because the stock market was booming, not even realizing their wealth was being hollowed out from the inside. That is the evil genius of embezzlement.
So the crucial point here is that Munger saw the entire dot-com economy as a house of cards. The hidden wealth effect was the flimsy structure, and this Fabiansment was like termites just eating away at the foundations. And he sounded this alarm right as the whole thing was about to come crashing down.
I mean, the timing of this speech was almost supernatural. He gave this warning in November of 2000, just as the dot-com bubble was starting to hiss air, and his prediction was just chillingly accurate. He said what was greater on the upside would be greater on the downside. And wow, was he right. The bust that followed was biblical. The market crashed, and trillions of dollars in paper wealth just vanished.
But for Munger, this was never just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It was about right and wrong. And for the people who were supposed to be protecting all that money, the trustees of foundations and pension funds, being ignorant was just not an excuse. In Munger's view, and he quotes Samuel Johnson here, it was nothing less than a profound moral failure, a treacherous malfeasance.
Munger's theory, it's so much more than a history lesson. It's a lens. It's a way of looking at the world. And it's a warning. And that brings us to the final, and I think unavoidable question. As we look at the economy today, with its own crazy booms and bubbles,
What hidden Feebelman might be lurking just beneath the surface, right now, just waiting to be discovered? So let's dive into the story of a company called Quant Technical Corporation. Now, this company is fictional, but its downfall is a startlingly realistic cautionary tale. It's basically a financial morality play that shows how one single, flawed accounting rule can bring a corporate giant to its knees and, believe it or not, drag an entire nation into a recession.
And you know what's fascinating is that this story isn't framed like some dry business case study. Nope, it's presented as a classic Greek tragedy. The story of Quantech is one where a single, fatal flaw, this tiny little crack in its foundation, guarantees a disastrous and totally inevitable end, not just for the company, but for everyone.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start in Act 1 with the founder's very principled way of doing things. Then we'll see how it all goes wrong with the options ploy in Act 2. We'll watch how a dollop of deception leads to the great collapse, and we'll finish up with a final judgment in the accountants in hell.
Okay, let's set the stage. Our story kicks off back in 1982. Quant Technical Corporation, led by its legendary founder Albert Herzog Quant, was literally the pinnacle of both engineering brilliance and financial honesty. I mean, this company was built on a foundation of solid rock.
This slide right here tells you everything you need to know. Quantech wasn't just a company. It was a financial fortress. It was making a ton of money and it had zero debt. The founder was a big believer in what Ben Franklin said, that it is hard for an empty sack to stand upright. So he kept $500 million in cash, just sitting there. And, this is crucial, every single employee was paid in cash. For the founder, Albert Quant, great engineering and honest accounting were two sides of the same coin. He looked at the common way companies accounted for stock options, and he didn't see a clever financial tool. He saw it as a form of corruption. In his exact words, it was weak, corrupt, and contemptible, and he wanted absolutely nothing to do with it.
But then, after the founder passed away in 1982, everything changed. The board, even though the company was doing great, got nervous about its low stock price. So they brought in a new CEO and CFO with one very simple mission: get the market cap higher and do it fast.
So the new guys looked at the business and they realized they couldn't actually make it any better. The founder had already perfected it. So what do? They turned to what they called modern financial engineering, and they find the perfect tool for the job, the exact accounting gimmick the founder hated. It was a rule that let them pay their people without ever having to record it as an expense.
And this is how the magic trick worked. It's brilliant, really. In 1982, Quantech paid out $400 million in cash bonuses. That was correctly reported as a $400 million expense. But by just switching that pay from cash to stock options of the exact same value, they could make that entire cost just disappear from the income statement. Poof! Reported profits would instantly shoot up from $100 million to $500 million. That's a 400% jump without the business earning a single extra dime. But here's the thing. These new executives were way too smart for that. They knew a 400% jump in profits overnight would set off all sorts of alarm bells. So instead, they came up with a much more cynical, long-term plan, one the CEO privately called wisely restrained falsehood.
Now get this. This is a private quote from the new CFO. It is absolutely chilling, and it lays out their plan perfectly. They decided to poison the company's financial reports so slowly, so methodically, dollop by dollop, that nobody would notice what was happening until it was way, way too late.
Their system was basically a playbook for how to exploit the system's weaknesses. First, be subtle. A small lie is always easier to get away with. Second, make sure no one can see the big picture. The cumulative effect over many years would be almost impossible for an outsider to track. Third, you trap the auditors. They figured, correctly, that once an accountant signs off on the books, it's unendurably embarrassing for them to admit they were wrong later. And finally, you maintain plausible deniability. Just say you're doing it to attract talent just like everybody else. And what was the results of all this? Well, you get this beautiful, perfect illusion of unstoppable growth. The real business was already projected to grow at an incredible 20% a year for 2 decades. But by adding their little dollop of fake earnings every year, they reported a perfectly smooth, never-changing 28% growth rate. And Wall Street, which absolutely loves predictability, was completely enchanted.
You know, a lie this big, it needs more lies to prop it up. They started issuing new stock to bring in fresh cash, which made the phony earnings look more believable.
They even cooked up these complicated foreign tax schemes to make their tax bill look normal. The whole deception became this tangled, self-perpetuating machine.
But you know how these things go. You can't fake gravity, and you can't fake growth forever. As the source material says, all these kinds of beautiful growth projections at last come to grief on a finite Earth. And in 2003, after 2 decades of lies, QuantTech's perfect straight line of 28% growth finally slammed hard into reality.
And when it fell apart, man, it fell apart fast. The moment real business growth finally slowed down from 20% to a more normal 4%, the whole house of cards collapsed. They just couldn't hide the gap anymore. The stock price immediately cratered by 50%, and that, finally, triggered the serious investigation that would expose the massive 20-year fraud to the entire world.
To really get a sense of the scale of this collapse, you have to look at these numbers. So let's just pause for a second. At its absolute peak in early 2003, the market believed QuantTech was worth a mind-boggling $1.4 trillion.
And then, just 6 months later, after the truth came spilling out, its real value was revealed. It was only worth $140 billion. That is a collapse of 90%.
So do the math. That's a loss of $1.3 trillion in shareholder value. Just gone. And this wasn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. This collapse caused immense human suffering for retirees, for regular investors, and the shockwave was so big it helped trigger a serious national recession.
So, of course, after a disaster this huge, a furious public wanted somebody's head on a platter. The story now shifts from a business tragedy to a kind of cosmic courtroom drama, with the case being brought before the highest possible authority for a final judgment.
The great judge in our story isn't just looking for any old culprit. He wants the mainspring of the crime. He wants to find the people who could have most easily stopped this whole catastrophe from ever happening, but simply chose not to. So one by one, the suspects are brought up and dismissed. Was it the security analysts who pushed the stock? Nope, they were just guilty of a simple thinking error, not malice. Okay, what about the politicians and the regulators at the SEC? Not them either. They were just caught in a maelstrom of regrettable forces. Well, surely it was the crooked executives at QuantTech, right? Close, but they were just exploiting the game. They didn't write the rules.
No, the ultimate traitors, the ones sent to the lowest circle of hell, were the rule makers themselves. They were the prominent, well-respected accounting partners who created and then defended this amazingly peculiar accounting rule in the first place. Think about it. These were smart, secure professionals who knew the rule was a disaster waiting to happen, yet they pushed it through anyway, all to keep their big corporate clients happy.
And it all comes down to this ancient piece of wisdom from Plato. A huge number of people, in this case the entire accounting profession in corporate America, decided that something couldn't possibly be evil if it was making them rich. The pleasure of those phantom profits and soaring stock prices became the ultimate incentive.
So yeah, the story of QuantTech is a work of fiction. It's a parable, but it leaves us with a very real and pretty unsettling question. It forces us all to look around and ask, what other seemingly small, peculiar conventions or flawed rules in our own world today are just sitting there, waiting to become the mainspring of the next great scandal?
Imagine this. You walk into a university's economics department. You've never taken a single economics class in your life, and you proceed to tell the assembled professors exactly what's wrong with their entire field. Well, that's pretty much what business legend Charlie Munger did. So let's dive into his brilliant and, honestly, provocative critique of what he called the queen of the soft sciences. Right off the bat, Munger knew he was an outsider, and he totally leaned into it. This wasn't just arrogance. It was his whole point of view. He wasn't tied down by the usual rules of one single discipline, and he was convinced that gave him a massive, massive advantage. So what gave him the right, the credibility to make such a bold claim? Well, it really comes down to one thing: the results. Pure and simple. Under Munger and his partner Warren Buffett, Berkshire Hathaway's market cap went from $10 million to $100 billion. That is a mind-blowing 10,000 to 1 return. I mean, that's not just a lucky break. That's a decades-long track record of success. And it was built on a philosophy that actively, purposefully ignored the big theories coming out of academic economics. And that really brings us to the million-dollar question, or in this case, the $100 billion question. How did Munger and Buffett pull this off, while paying, and these are Munger's words, not 1 ounce of attention to stuff like efficient market theory?
Well, the answer is all in his unique worldview. You see, he basically had two laboratories. The first one was the real world of Berkshire Hathaway, where ideas were tested with billions of actual dollars on the line. And the second was his own mind, which he had deliberately filled with the biggest, most powerful ideas from every major discipline. He just couldn't stand the idea of reaching for some small idea in his own field when a huge, powerful idea was just sitting there right over the fence in another one.
Now, what's so interesting about Munger's critique is that it wasn't just some big takedown. No, he actually started his whole speech by acknowledging the incredible strengths of economics. He called it the queen of the soft sciences for a very good reason. He pointed out that economics basically grew up alongside the Industrial Revolution, so it was perfectly positioned to explain a world that was just exploding with growth. He also said it was always better at borrowing ideas from other fields. And, from Adam Smith all the way to John Maynard Keynes, it attracted these brilliant minds who could also write beautifully. It's this balance, this fairness, that makes his critique so powerful when it comes. Okay, so after giving credit where credit was due, Munger presented 9 specific problems he had with the field. For our purposes, we've grouped them into what are really 3 fundamental flaws that he saw everywhere, not just in economics: a fatal unconnectedness, a really dangerous envy of physics, and a profound, almost shocking ignorance of psychology. So the first big flaw is something Munger famously called man with a hammer syndrome. It's this idea that academic fields just become way too isolated. Economists only talk to other economists, psychologists only talk to other psychologists, and each group tries to solve every single problem using only the limited set of tools from their own profession. The cure for this, Munger said, is to build a full kit of mental tools. And here's a major consequence of that syndrome. Because economists have all these fancy statistical tools, they tend to give way too much weight to the factors they can actually measure precisely. But what about the things that are hugely important but really hard to put a number on? Things like trust, or a company's culture, or brand reputation. Well, those things often get ignored completely, and that leads to these massive errors in judgment. This famous quote from Einstein is the perfect intro to Munger's second major critique. He believed that economics, because it wanted so badly to be seen as a hard science, developed a really dangerous condition. And he had a great name for it: physics envy. Now, let's be really clear here. Munger loved the ethos of hard science, that habit of boiling problems down to their most basic parts. What he couldn't stand was the craving for unattainable precision. See, economics deals with messy, complex human systems, not predictable little particles. When you apply these rigid, physics-like formulas to people, it doesn't make your work more scientific, it just makes it dangerously wrong. And hey, this isn't just some abstract academic debate. This physics envy has disastrous real-world consequences. Take this example. A consultant, armed with one of these flawed academic theories, told the Washington Post not to do something that, once Warren Buffett convinced them to ignore the consultant and do it, ended up making their shareholders over $1 billion richer. $1 billion! Okay, now for the third core flaw. And this is the one Munger thought was the most obvious: a profound ignorance of psychology. To show you what he meant, he liked to pose this simple puzzle. You've got 50 identical slot machines. They all pay out at the exact same rate, and yet one of them, no matter where you put it on the casino floor, consistently makes 25% more money. The question is, why? The answer has absolutely nothing to do with standard economics and everything to do with basic, simple psychology. The winning machine is programmed for more near misses, like 2 cherries and a lemon. That little trick powerfully triggers the human brain's reward system, and it causes people to just keep playing that one machine over and over. It's a simple psychological insight that standard economic models completely, totally miss. And this ignorance of psychology isn't just about slot machines. It also leads to this massive failure to think about second-order effects. When the original Medicare law was passed, economists wildly underestimated how much it would cost, by a factor of 10, 1,000% off. They totally failed to predict how real people and doctors would change their behavior once the new incentives were in the system. It's a classic psychological blind spot. So after laying out all these problems, Munger offered a solution. And the answer isn't to just build a better, more complicated economic model. No, the answer is to stop thinking like an economist and start thinking like a problem solver, armed with a full kit of tools from every single useful discipline you can find. So let's see how this builds into a practical way of thinking. Munger laid out this rough algorithm for how to think about success, and it forces you to use different mental tools.
Is a company like Costco winning by just minimizing price down to the bone? Is a company like Toyota winning by just being incredibly good across many, many factors? Or is a company like Oracle winning because it caught a huge technological wave? This checklist forces you to look at a problem from all these different angles. All right, here's another one of Munger's classic puzzles that he used to stump business school students. And this one goes directly against the most basic supply and demand curve that everyone learns on day one of economics. When does raising the price of something actually make people buy more of it, not less? Well, the answers require you to mix economics with psychology and real-world strategy. A higher price can act as a status symbol for luxury goods. It can signal higher quality for, say, a critical airplane part. The extra money could be used to actually improve the product. Or in the sleazy parts of the investment world, it can be used to pay higher commissions that basically bribe brokers into selling a terrible product. A pure economist struggles with this question. A multidisciplinary thinker sees all the answers almost instantly. And all of this brings us right to the heart of Munger's philosophy. It's a way of thinking that values practical, real-world wisdom way more than some elegant theory. It's all about accepting the messy reality of the world and arming yourself with the right tools to deal with it. This really gets to intellectual honesty. Munger's point here is that you just have to be willing to absorb basic wisdom from the real world, not just from a textbook. The world is not going to bend to your spreadsheet, and if you blindly follow a flawed model, whether it's in finance or in life, well, you're going to get the poor results you deserve. Munger often quoted another great thinker, John Maynard Keynes, to drive his point home, and this quote is the perfect antidote to physics envy. It's an admission that in complex systems, a messy, approximate understanding of reality is infinitely more valuable than a beautiful, precise, and totally wrong formula. And that, right there, is the ultimate takeaway from Munger's entire critique. The goal isn't to find the one perfect theory that explains everything. It's to build a latticework, a network of mental models from all the major fields, psychology, physics, biology, history, and then learn how to use them, like a checklist, to understand the world as it actually is, complex, paradoxical, and endlessly fascinating. And we'll end with Munger's powerful promise. Once you actually start thinking this way, using all the tools that are available to you, that old, narrow way of seeing the world, it just becomes impossible to go back to. It would be like cutting off your own hands. Why would you ever want to solve a complex problem with just one tool when you have the whole toolkit?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are cracking open the mind of an absolute legend, Charlie Munger. We're going to dive into one of his most famous speeches and pull out a real, step-by-step guide for living not just a successful life, but more importantly, a wise one.
Okay, so here's how we're going to break it down. We've structured his big ideas into 6 core parts. We'll kick things off with the simple, incredibly powerful idea that's at the heart of everything. From there, we'll get into the mental tools he uses to slice through complex problems, and we'll finish up with what he sees as the ultimate goal of it all. All right, first up, we're starting with what Munger considers the absolute bedrock of his entire philosophy for life, for business, for everything. It's an idea so simple you might just brush past it, but trust me, everything else is built right on top of this. What he's doing here is basically applying the golden rule to your ambitions. It's a total rejection of shortcuts, of trying to game the system. The entire focus is on becoming genuinely worthy of the things you're chasing. Munger's take is that you should be trying to deliver something to the world that you yourself would be thrilled to buy.
And here's the real payoff. This whole approach, it leads to something way more valuable than just a bigger bank account. Munger says that the people who live this way, they end up earning the deep respect and trust of others. He calls this deserved trust, and he believes it's one of the most profound sources of happiness you can possibly find.
So if the big goal is to deserve success, how in the world do you do that? Well, for Munger, this leads us right into our second big principle. See, he doesn't think of learning as some kind of hobby. He sees it as a fundamental moral duty. Acquiring wisdom isn't just a nice to have, it is your core responsibility.
But, just knowing that wisdom is a duty, that isn't enough. Munger says there's a vital, connected idea that you absolutely have to embrace if you're ever going to get that wisdom. Without this next habit, your knowledge will just stagnate and you will get left in the dust. And the answer is, you have to become a continuous learning machine. It's a habit that Munger sees as a kind of superpower, especially over a long career. He points right to his partner, Warren Buffett, who famously spends about half of his day just reading and thinking.
The goal is simple, but it's incredibly powerful. Just try to go to bed every single night a little bit wiser than you were when you woke up.
But it turns out how you learn is everything. Munger tells this fantastic story about the Nobel-winning physicist Max Planck and his chauffeur, and it perfectly illustrates the critical difference between real, deep knowledge and just the appearance of it. Getting this right is a game changer.
So here's the breakdown. On one hand, you have Planck knowledge. This is the real deal. It's earned through hard work, through struggle, through genuine understanding. On the other hand, you have chauffeur knowledge. This is just the performance of expertise. It's the person who can say all the right words, but underneath there's no real comprehension. Munger's warning here is pretty stark. A huge part of your job in life is to get real responsibility into the hands of the Plancks and keep it as far away from the chauffeurs as you can. So how do you actually build that real Planck-level knowledge? Munger is insistent on this. You have to build what he calls a mental latticework. You can't just be an expert in your own little field. You have to learn the big foundational ideas from all the major disciplines. We're talking physics, history, psychology, you name it, and you hang your experiences on that framework. Without that, he warns, you're going to live in the middle ranks to the shallows, and it doesn't matter how smart you are. Okay, now we get to one of Munger's most famous and honestly most powerful mental tools. It's a counterintuitive trick he uses to solve those really difficult, messy problems that leave most of us totally stuck.
Our natural instinct, right, is to tackle a huge question like this head-on. But Munger says that's usually the least effective way to do it. He tells this story about an old country guy who said, "All I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there." And that really stuck with him.
This is the art of inversion. By literally turning the problem upside down, the path forward often becomes way, way simpler. Instead of trying to figure out all the millions of ways you might help, you start by identifying what would do the most harm. Things like causing a famine or starting a civil war. And then you just avoid those things like the plague. It's a technique that can untangle problems that seem completely impossible.
And you can apply this process to pretty much any challenge. Whatever you're trying to achieve, first figure out exactly what you want to avoid. What would absolutely guarantee failure? Once you pinpoint those causes, you can just systematically make sure you steer clear of them. It's a powerful way to get clarity.
So getting wisdom is one thing, but Munger warns that it's just as important to protect your mind from self-destructing. You have to learn how to actively navigate what is basically a cognitive minefield of biases and terrible ideas that can lead you straight to ruin.
Munger is incredibly blunt about certain ways of thinking. He doesn't see them as small character flaws. He sees them as direct highways to folly. Let's walk through a few of the biggest mental traps he warns us to avoid at all costs.
Munger is just ruthless about the danger of intense ideology. He says it literally cabbages up one's mind. His iron prescription for avoiding this is simple but tough. You are not entitled to have an opinion on a subject unless you can state the arguments against your own position better than your opponents can. We all have this natural tendency to believe that what's good for us is good for everybody. Munger points to the genius Mozart, who was apparently miserable for much of his life because he was constantly spending more than he earned. Why? Because he felt he was entitled to a grander lifestyle. And the lesson is pretty clear. If one of the greatest geniuses in history couldn't make that attitude work, what on earth makes you think you can?
Okay, so all this theory is great, but how do you actually apply it in the real, messy world? It's not enough to just know these principles, you have to put them into practice. So let's look at Munger's advice for turning all this wisdom into real-world action.
Munger says he learned this one from Ben Franklin. Even when your motives are totally pure, you have to account for that powerful self-serving bias in other people. He tells a story about a brilliant lawyer who got fired because he told his CEO they had a moral duty to do something. Wrong approach. He should have said, "Look, this is likely to blow up and destroy you." Now that would have worked. Munger loves this word, assiduity. And he loves it because of what it means in practice. There is simply no substitute for sheer, dogged persistence and hard work. He talks about two partners he had who made a pact. Anytime they were behind, they would both work 14 hours a day, 7 days a week, until they were caught up. That firm, he says, did not fail.
Life is going to hit you with some terrible, unfair blows. That's a guarantee. Some people recover from that, others are just destroyed. Munger draws on the Stoic philosopher Epictetus here, who believed that every single misfortune is actually an opportunity to behave well, to learn something, and to reject the poison of self-pity. The choice, Munger says, is yours. Use that terrible blow constructively.
So after all of this, the constant learning, the mental gymnastics of inversion, the sheer hard work, what's the point? What is the ultimate goal? What are we actually building toward? For Munger, the final scorecard isn't about the number in your bank account. It's something much, much deeper. This, for Munger, is the highest form of human achievement, a network of totally reliable people who correctly and completely trust one another. It's how an operating room at the Mayo Clinic works, not with complicated rules and procedures, but with implicit earned trust. That is the system you want to try and build in your own life.
Munger finishes his speech with this quote from an old book, Pilgrim's Progress. He's laid out all the principles, he's shown you the path, he is passing the torch, leaving you with both the tools and the challenge to build a wise, effective, and truly deserved life. He's handed you the sword, and now the only question left is, can you wield it?
Have you ever seen someone incredibly smart make a decision that was just catastrophically bad, and you just shake your head and wonder, how on earth did that happen? Well, today we're diving into the definitive answer with Charlie Munger's masterpiece, The Psychology of Human Misjudgment. He basically created a field guide to all the mental glitches that trip us up. And trust me, understanding them is like getting a superpower. And this quote right here, this is the key to his entire philosophy. You see, while everyone else is out there looking for the secret to success, Munger was busy studying failure. He hunted for recipes for disaster. He believed that real wisdom isn't about knowing what to do. It's about knowing what not to do. He called this inversion, and it's the bedrock of everything we're about to get into. So here's our game plan for unpacking his brilliant mind. First, we're going to look at what set Munger on this quest in the first place. Then we'll hit the big one, the superpower of incentives. And after that, the common glitches in our own brain's software. From there, we'll see how our emotions can totally hijack our thinking, which all leads up to his grand theory, the Lollapalooza Effect. And don't worry, we'll finish up by giving you Munger's personal toolkit to fight back against all of it. Now, you'd think a guy with degrees from Caltech and Harvard Law would have the world pretty much figured out, right? Well, not Munger. He looked around and saw what he called extreme irrationality everywhere. Smart, accomplished people were making terrible, self-destructive choices, and his fancy education gave him absolutely no tools to understand why. He knew something huge was missing. He had this incredible insight. Real-world problems just don't care about academic departments, you know? A business problem isn't just a finance problem. It's a psychology problem, a history problem, and a physics problem all rolled into one. So he set off on this amazing lifelong journey to teach himself the most powerful ideas from every major field, hoping to build a more accurate map of how the world actually works. And that brings us back to his secret weapon, inversion. It's so simple, it's genius. Instead of asking, how do we make this project a success? He would flip it on its head and ask, what are all the ways we could absolutely guarantee this thing will fail? Then he'd just make a list. Terrible communication, mismatched incentives, ignoring facts, and his whole job became just avoiding that list. It's an unbelievably effective way to get ahead. All right, this leads us to what Munger considered the single most important force in the universe of human behavior. He'd argued that before you even think about anything else, you have to grapple with the absolute superpower of incentives. Get this. Munger said that even after studying incentives his entire life, he still felt like he was underestimating their power. It's that big a deal. If you want to know how someone's going to act, forget what they say. Just look at how they get paid or what they get punished for. Incentives don't just shape our behavior. They literally warp our reality and change how we think. And there's no better example of this than the old Federal Express story. The company was on the brink of failure because the night crew just couldn't get the planes loaded on time. Management tried everything. Pep talks, begging, paying them by the hour, nothing worked. Then, someone had a breakthrough. The company didn't need hours of work, it needed a job done. So they changed the pay from per hour to per shift. The deal was, as soon as the planes were loaded, you could go home. And like magic, a job that used to drag on for hours was suddenly getting done in half the time. The incentive was aligned perfectly with the goal. This really became one of his golden rules. Munger basically said that whether you're looking at a corporate scandal, a new government policy, or even just a fight between siblings, the very first question you have to ask is, what are the incentives here? It's like having X-ray vision for human motivation. But here's the scary part. Incentives have a really dark side. Munger called it incentive-caused bias. He told this chilling story about a surgeon who was removing perfectly healthy gallbladders by the dozen.
Now, the crazy thing is, this doctor wasn't some evil guy twirling his mustache. No, his financial incentive to do surgeries had subconsciously convinced him he truly believed that the gallbladder was the source of all medical evil. His own mind created a rationalization for doing something terrible. And that happens everywhere. Okay, so on top of incentives pulling us from the outside, Munger found a whole other class of problems, glitches right in our own mental software. You know these little shortcuts our brains take to save energy? Most of the time they're fine, but in the wrong situation, they can make our judgment fail, and fail spectacularly. The biggest glitch of all is just how much our brains hate to change. Once we form an idea or a habit, it's like a mental door slams shut behind it, and it's really, really hard for a new idea to get in. We are just wired to avoid inconsistency, so we cling to our first impressions, our habits, our identities, even when the evidence is screaming at us that we're wrong. And here you can see the glitch versus the antidote in perfect contrast. The default setting for most of us is what's called confirmation bias. We go out looking for proof that we're already right. But a genius like Charles Darwin did the exact opposite. He knew about this weakness in himself, so he made it a rule to pay special attention to any evidence that disproved his favorite ideas. That single mental habit was his superpower. And a couple of other big ones are social proof and contrast misreaction. Social proof is basically our monkey see, monkey do tendency. When we're not sure what to do, we just copy the people around us. Contrast misreaction is how salespeople get you. You're buying a $65,000 car, so what's another $1,000 for a fancy dashboard? It seems like nothing, but you would never ever pay $1,000 for that same dashboard if you were buying it on its own. Your brain isn't seeing the real price, it's just comparing it to the much bigger number. So it's not just about outside forces or software glitches. Sometimes our own feelings can storm the cockpit and completely hijack our rational brain, twisting the world to fit how we feel. I mean, think about it. When we love someone, we're blind to their flaws. When we hate someone, we're blind to their good qualities. It's that simple. And then there's what Munger called Deprival-Super reaction. The psychological pain of losing $10 is way, way stronger than the pleasure of finding $10. He told this great story about his family dog, sweetest dog in the world, but if you tried to take food out of its mouth, it would bite you. That primal irrational fear of loss is wired deep inside us too. So, we've got incentives, we've got mental glitches, we've got emotional reactions. But here's where Munger tied it all together with his most important insight. In the real world, these things don't happen one at a time. They collide and they combine, creating results that are just off the charts. And he gave this a fantastic name, the Lollapalooza Effect. This is when you get 2, 3, 4 of these psychological tendencies all pushing in the same direction at once. The result isn't just additive. It's not 1 + 1 = 2. It's more like 1 + 1 = 5. It's an explosion. This is the secret to understanding really extreme human behavior, for both good and evil. I mean, this is how you get crazy things like cults that turn regular people into devoted followers in a weekend. Munger figured out their formula. They start with inconsistency avoidance. They get you to agree to one small thing. Then they pile on social proof. You're surrounded by other believers. And finally, they crank up the stress with things like sleep deprivation. The combination of those forces creates this powerful mental vortex that's almost impossible to escape. Okay, so just knowing about all these flaws is one thing, but that wasn't enough for Munger. The whole point of this massive project was to figure out how to fight back, to build a set of real, practical tools to improve your own thinking. And the good news is, we can. You fight back with these mental tools. You use checklists like a surgeon or a pilot because your brain will miss things when you're stressed. You always practice inversion by asking what could go wrong. To protect yourself from biased advice, learn the basics of what your advisor does. And maybe the most important one, make it a habit, just like Darwin, to go looking for the evidence that proves your most cherished beliefs are wrong. In the end, what Munger gave us is an incredible gift. He didn't just point out our flaws, he basically handed us a user's manual for our own brain. He showed us where the bugs are in the system and gave us the patches to fix them. He drew us a map to our own irrationality. And the question he leaves us with is a really powerful one. Now that you know the enemy is inside your own head, what are you going to do about it?